Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Genius retrospective, where obviously we're here 10 years after its initial release. I'll be talking about Season 3 of the Genius Black Garnet. A season that, I'll be honest, I never fully clicked with, to where while I do love The Genius, and Genius is, again, my favorite reality show of all time, and again, I even rated all 4 seasons of The Genius as top 10 reality TV seasons of all time, I do feel like Black Garnet is the season of the bunch that I just never really gelled as much with, where, again, it's still The Genius. I still love The Genius, and I do think it's a season that, again, I know a lot of people do look at as the best season of the bunch, and I think there's a lot of merit to that. I think the season has debatably the best cast, from a gameplay perspective of all time, again, debating it with Season 4, but I think this season probably enacts its potential a bit more. But then from a game design front, I think this is probably the peak of the series. I think the season contains some of the best main matches and death matches in the series' history, to where, again, I think there is a lot to like from this season. However, the season, I remember when I originally watched it, I did not like it as much as the previous seasons. And I think that's further supported by my rewatch here, to where I think over time, I kind of went a bit higher on the season. As time went on, my exact memories of it kind of faded away. Again, I remembered all those positives. Yet now having rewatched the season, again, it's still very good, but I just feel like I have this connection to the other seasons a bit more, to where, again, I still like this season. We'll still talk extensively about the season, but the season that, again, just for some reason does not gel with me as much as the previous seasons. But anyway, we'll still be talking about the season from beginning to end, starting it off with the premiere, which starts with a quote from Howard Gardner about multiple intelligences, and we get this like weird thing about Andy Warhol's low IQ, and again, this was just kind of pointless. Again, it feels weird that this entire intro sequence was focused around multiple intelligences, only for that to not come up ever again. But we do get introduced to this cast with CCTV footage, which was clearly staged, though I do think there's a couple interesting things to talk about with this cast, where first up, this is the first ever cast to include non-celebs, where there was an application process that was opened up for this season that allowed for a few normal people to make it onto the cast, with many of those normal people being this season's biggest players, to where it is strange to think that The Genius is a show that didn't even allow normal people to enter it until its final newbie season. And I think it clearly shows that this could have been the trajectory of the show had the show continued beyond season 4, though we'll obviously never see that realized. Though another thing I do want to mention here is the fact that this is actually the first ever season without Jinho and Sangmin, and what turns out to be the only season without Jinho and Sangmin. And seeing a season without, again, Sangmin in particular, who's such a star of the first 2 seasons, again, maybe a reason why I don't connect with this season as much. Though, really, I think, in general, the main reason why I don't connect with this season as much is because, straight up, I don't think this cast is that entertaining. Where, we do get, again, some great characters from the likes of Dongmin and Ah Young. Again, Kyung-hoon brings a lot of entertainment early on. I feel like the majority of the rest of this cast are not the most riveting TV. Where, while they are very good players, again, from the likes of Hyunmin and Yo-hyun and people like Jongbom, again, these people aren't the greatest TV. To where, again, I think that is definitely something that's affecting my opinion of this season as well, to where again, while again the people that applied for the application process were, again, very good players, they were kind of a bit hit or miss from an entertainment standpoint, and really just in general, the actual celebrities on this season were very hit or miss as well, where, again, I just think this is a cast that, again, I just don't find as entertaining, where, again, I think the quality of the season is really elevated by the level of gameplay, but, again, from a pure entertainment front, I don't feel like this is a particularly entertaining cast. But anyway, we obviously eventually get our more standard intro of Yeonju opening a box to find a Garnet, to where we then get montage of others finding it as well. Where we have Bandage Man giving his typical spiel, and we see them arriving at the set, where the first person to enter here ends up being Yeon-sok, a very controversial figure, to where, again, very strange how he was like one of the bigger names for this cast, yet, and he's someone that I believe has made like some very questionable comments outside the show, and in many ways kind of essentially the Gura of this cast. I think less entertaining than Gura, but also looked at as just as threatening as Gura, as we do proceed to see Jongbom enter and talk about how he's scared of him, where obviously his threat management from Yeon-sok ends up being his biggest issue in the game. We then see Ah Young enter, who talks about having known Yeon-sok from an alumni party as they both went to Harvard, which gets mentioned a lot on this season, but says that he turned her away, with it now referencing one of the questionable comments that Yeon-sok made about female announcers, which got him kicked out of his political party. Which, again, I do find the concept of them just joking around about this very strange here, but anyway, we then get Yeonju entering, leading to a funny interaction of Jumbo Dom talking about being a big fan of hers, only for Yeonsuk to just openly say that I don't know who she is. After that, we do see Dongmin entering, who gets an interesting introduction here in the fact that we see everybody laugh as he enters, with us getting the instant comparison to him and Hongchul, despite the fact that they end up being radically different players. But obviously, Dongmin's clearly not taken seriously right off the bat, despite the fact that he ends up being one of the central figures of strategy on this season and ends up being, again, the best Genius player of all time. But after that, we do get Sujin entering, to where she's upset at seeing Dongmin there. Which they show us a clip of them having been on a previous show together, which, again, strange that they're doing this again. This is literally just a repeat of doing Hongchul and Yunsun. So it's very strange they had this exact same dynamic the following season. Either way, Junghoon ends up entering next, with Dongmin being excited as they're friends, only for us to cut to professional where Junghoon talks about wanting to take out Dongmin himself, which doesn't lead to anything. And really, just in general, the Dongmin-Junghoon relationship is one that is completely overshadowed on this season, despite it being set up to be a pretty major one here. Either way, we then get Juri entering, who ends up revealing that the main dealer on the show is actually from the same company that she works for, which is questionable why they allowed her on if there's that potential conflict of interest. But either way, then we get the next 4 people to enter, all being applicants from the audition process. First up being Yohyun, who ends up being one of the bigger players of this season, instantly looked at as a massive threat by the others, with him being a former poker player. So again, he seems to come in with a pretty big bullseye on his back. We then get Hyunmin entering, with instant talk about how much younger he is to the rest of the cast, with him only being 19, which is kind of insane that someone that young is going on the Genius and ends up performing as well as he does. Where I think the fact that he ends up being one of the best players in Genius history, despite the fact that he is so much younger than the rest of this cast, ends up being a pretty big surprise here. Then we also get Yeonsung entering, who is an oriental doctor, leading to a weird string of jokes about him being a foreign competitor, and Junghoon comparing him to the movie Apocalypto, because I guess he doesn't know that Mayans are a thing outside of a movie. But again, this is just a very strange sequence there. But then we get Kyunghoon entering, with him instantly getting this bit of dodo content, with Dongmin mocking him and telling him to shut the door, with Kyunghoon obviously coming off as this pretty wacky character. Again, probably the biggest character to come from the audition process, to where, and while we won't get that much of him on this season, what we do get ends up being pretty strong, and obviously we get a lot more of him on the following season. But anyway, the final person to enter ends up being the only returnee for the season, and that person is Huijong, the first boot of the previous season, with him having a polar opposite reaction to what Kyunghoon had, and him ignoring Dongmin as he comes in. And again, this ends up being a cool return here. I was very happy to see Huijong return here after him having a pretty glorious downfall in season 2, but one that, again, definitely showed a lot of promise. So again, I very much expected Huijong to be this massive threat in the game, and the fact that he was taken out in the first round of that game was such a big surprise there, to where seeing him back here, I was personally very excited for that. Now, again, it technically also makes it so that not a single season of the Genius outside of season 1 has no semblance of returnees on it. But again, if you are going to bring somebody back here, I feel like Huijong was a very inspired choice here. And his return makes it so that every single first boot of the Genius outside of the first boot from this season ends up playing twice. But eventually, obviously, the dealers end up coming in with Bandage Man going over the rules, revealing some modifications to the format here. First, revealing that the Garnets of the deathmatch players will be left with the host and will only be returned to the winning player, with the losing player's Garnets going out of the game, seemingly being a reaction to Yohwan's Zero Garnet run last season, where obviously this incentivizes you to have less Garnets. Where unlike in previous seasons, the people with big Garnet counts would be targeted because people would want those Garnets. In this situation, it'll be the opposite. People want to target people with less Garnets because they don't want those Garnets out of the game. And through that, again, it feels like a reaction to Yohwan's run, which, again, I assume they didn't particularly like. But in exchange, the winner of the deathmatch will instead get a black Garnet, obviously the name of the season, where by having 3 black Garnets, you'll be allowed to play in a black mission, to where if you succeed, you'll be exempt from going to the deathmatch, and also get to pick your replacement, which is essentially this season's version of the Token of Immortality. Essentially having the exact same power as that, though the way you activate it is obviously very different. Where, personally, I just find this twist to be a worse version of it, one that really does the big no-no for any twist, in essentially just benefiting the majority more so in how black Garnets can obviously be shared within each other, to where the fact that you need 3 of them, which is very unlikely that you yourself are able to get 3 black Garnets on your own, makes it so that you're going to have to get black garnets from others, meaning again the majority has a massive advantage in doing so, meaning that this just makes it more likely that two people of the minority are going against each other in a death match, which again is not a particularly good outcome. But also from a pure TV perspective, it's also just not good TV. To where, at least with the Token of Immortality, again, there was this intrigue and seeing people find clues and do this hunt around the house. Yet here, again, you don't have that. You're simply just given black garnets that you're able to hand in eventually. And even then, the black missions themselves are not interesting in their own right. And along with that, I also feel like the knowledge of having this constant buffer in the game adds less stakes to the main matches down the road, especially when we get to the later rounds where we see people even intentionally playing to lose so that they can use their black garnets to go to a black mission, which, again, just in general, I feel like this is just a bad twist. Though really by the end of it, it plays almost no factor into anything, with no one ever actually succeeding in a black mission, which kind of makes this all funny. But also, we're getting another pretty pointless addition to the format in that the death match is put into an envelope, which is then put into a cage, which will get revealed after the main match, which, like, why? I guess, like, was there some talk about the death matches potentially being rigged to where they decided to do this? But even then, this doesn't really prove anything, as obviously this could be theoretically just edited in, where I guess it's for the players themselves, but again, all this just felt kind of pointless. Now, I should mention that there also is a new rule added for this season, kind of, in the fact that we do get them openly talking about here, there being a rule against theft and violence, to where if you do so, you automatically be the elimination candidate for the day, which, from what I understand, I believe there were already rules over theft and violence beforehand. Yeah, again, the fact that they ended up emphasizing this on the show and added in this aspect of you automatically losing the game if you do so, again, feels like an addition here obviously made due to the Doohy situation in Season 2, though it really ends up being a rule that never even comes close to actually being utilized here. But anyway, with this, we finally get to the first main match, that being Fruit Stand. A very solid first game for this season, though not as complicated as something like Food Chain or as simplistic as something like 1-2-3 game. It kind of feels like something in the middle of those. A game where there are 6 different fruits given out at random, with each player getting 2, where players with the same fruit are in a price war, with the lowest bid getting to sell all the fruit for that price. This ends up occurring over 4 rounds, where everyone bids between 1 and 5. For those with the lowest bids end up sharing all the profits, where the player with the highest earnings by the end obviously is the winner, while the person with the lowest earnings goes to the death match. A relatively simple game that allows for collaboration between people grouped together by fruits, to where if they don't screw each other, they will essentially be near guaranteed to not be in last. But also, considering garnets are doled out through this round for every certain amount that you make, it incentivizes the player to work together somewhat to increase the prize pool. But also, this game still incentivizes backstabbing, with these bids being done in secret, but also adding in this interesting mechanic of the addition of abilities you could use once per game in secrets, which allows you to keep the selling price secret for 1 fruit for 1 round, or you can use change to change your fruit midway through the game, allowing you to shift up your allies midway through the game, along with the fact that certain fruit will also have more people, meaning more opportunities to make money, but also more of a struggle in keeping everyone in line. But to where, while there's obviously a very easy way to game the system here and play optimally, which we actually don't end up seeing anyone do on this season, so it's not figured out until the next season, I do think there's also another issue in this game, in the fact that what if no one betrays anybody? As at that point, there's just this massive tie to where, again, to me, that is a pretty big issue of this game, in that you're very much relying on someone backstabbing their team, as if it doesn't happen, essentially, you can theoretically get a massive tie between everybody, though obviously that doesn't end up happening here, and the way that it does play out ends up being pretty fun, though it does take a bit to get into. So right away, we do get a lot of open talk about strategy, with Yuyan and Dongmin in particular debating over the optimal strat, which, why are you doing this out in the open? This is just increasing your threat level and you being able to think through this game very quickly. We do see Yuyan talk about monopolizing fruit and working with others, while Dongmin says that's bad, as people can betray you. So why not go for the sole win? Which, again, makes Dongmin look even worse in this instance, and him seeming to get away with it simply because no one took him seriously at this point in the game. This is where we cut to Huizhong, who talks about being quiet and that he can't be eliminated first twice in a row, and he needs to avoid sticking out this time, only for him to then go and tell others what he's planning, and that everyone should go and sell for 5 to essentially guarantee that everyone gets garnets for the prize pool, which doesn't work out too well, though to be fair, it did seem like the trajectory of this challenge from the offset, that. But again, funny for Huijong to just talk about going under the radar, only for him to make the strategy that the majority of people follow for the first round. But again, we get to round 1, where we do get a random draw for fruits, where we do see some instant pairs form, people getting the exact same 2 fruits, with many of those relationships end up being ones that actually last beyond this round, where we see the likes of Junghoon and Sujin work together, with them also working alongside Huijong and Dongmin, who end up being a pair here, with Dongmin taking the lead in most of their conversations, with Huijong talking about wanting to control things from behind Dongmin, with, again, at least now seeming to learn from last time, but also, again, still kind of parallels last time in him building this relationship with Hongchul. But again, all 4 of these players end up having watermelons, where they end up organizing together here alongside Hyungmin. They end up essentially forming one side of the house, though with Hyungmin obviously being a very savvy player, he ends up trying to play both sides here. Though clearly people end up realizing what he's doing here and worry about how loyal he is, only for Dongmin to seem to trust him off the bat, despite also calling him an idiot for talking about wanting to use secrets, which is, again, incredible social game from Dongmin off the bat. But this does lead to the flash forward of us seeing Watermelon selling for 1 and us seeing Dongmin have a shocked face, which ends up being very misleading here. But again, that's the point of flash forwards. I think it's fine that they're misleading, as it obviously ends up masking this bigger reveal for later in the show, and really subverting your expectations, which is the strongest way to use flash forwards. But anyway, we do see Jungbom and Yohyun end up organizing the other side against Dongmin's group, which essentially sums up this season, but along with them are Ayoung and Kyunghoon, who have the same fruits, to where they end up instantly bonding, though we do proceed to get constant content of Ayoung being paranoid, and telling Kyunghoon that she's putting all of her trust into him, which I wonder if that will matter. But they do proceed to talk about adding Juri into their alliance, with Juri not getting any inherent allies with the random draw, and wants to switch to have the same fruit as Ayoung and Kyunghoon. Though, as Ayoung proceeds to tell Yohyun about this, we then see Juri now talking to Dongmin and Huijong, to where they end up winning her over instead. Which, I mean, all this is pretty poor play from Juri, as it really just gives the majority now a reason to vote her in. Though, to be fair, I mean, she probably would have been a relatively easy person to vote in for a deathmatch anyway, but I do think the way that she handles the situation is not particularly optimal. But again, the first round ends up going really smoothly here, with everyone bidding 5, meaning everyone's tied at the end of the round. But round 2 is where we do see the sides finally starting to make moves against each other, where we do see the majority planning on using secrets on Watermelon, all while they want Hyunmin to sabotage them by using a 4 or 3 to steal points away from them and make them the losers, which again, Hyunmin ends up being a pretty savvy player here and recognizing that if something goes wrong with this plan, it's actually not a good plan for him, as he'll probably end up picking him for the death match, which has him not really wanting this plan to go through. Though on the other side, we see the Watermelons essentially create a similar plan of using secrets on the other fruits to create distrust between them, where while this makes it a lot less obvious to the other players of who exactly is in the lead, everyone does actually still end up bidding 5 despite all these secrets being in use. So we do end up seeing Kyunghoon seemingly consider going against this plan, only to say next time, which I wonder if that will matter. But anyway, it takes us to round 3, where the Watermelons do end up fracturing here, ironically having the plan they also thought up working against them in this spot. Sujin ends up starting to lose trust with Dongmin, with her ratting out her side, Ayoung and Kyunghoon, seemingly spooking Youngmin here and finally picking a side with him being exposed, though through this, we do later cut to Hyungmin telling Dongmin that someone from the other side is about to change fruits, leading to a flashback on Hyungmin, completely ratting out the watermelons, to where Yohyun creates this plan to change himself into a watermelon and end up sabotaging them by bidding 1 to make sure the other watermelons come in last, with them also agreeing to give the token to Hyungmin for his cooperation, though we do end up seeing the watermelons obviously counter this by bidding 1 themselves, which again, I don't get how the majority didn't think this was a thing that was going to happen once they learned that Yohyun switched teams. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's not enough to take them out of hot water here, where this ends up seemingly being game over for watermelons, as long as the majority ends up sticking together for the following round. This ends up essentially being a foolproof plan where the watermelons are all fighting within each other for last, which again, I'm sure nothing will go wrong there. But let's take us to the final round, which largely revolves around the watermelons scrambling with them, again, obviously trying to avoid last by trying to make money off their other fruits and making deals with others in order to do so, with a lot of focus on this round coming from Huijong and his fellow apples, as we do see Huijong creating a plan to backstab Youngsuk in bid 4, allowing him, Dongmin, and Juri to avoid being at the bottom against Sujin and Junghoon, to which Juri ends up convincing him to tell Youngsuk about this, to which Youngsuk does agree to this plan, as either way he's safe from being at the bottom anyway. So for a while, again, this could make it more likely that someone like Jung-hoon or Sujin end up picking for the death match. I still stand by. I do think this is probably the right call for him to gain more social capital with the other apples in a way that doesn't do him that much harm in the game, though at the same time, the social capital doesn't really end up helping him much down the road. But here we also get this subplot revolving around Hyunmin's attempts to get Huijong thrown into the death match, with the other players rejecting that because of human decency, which I will say, I don't get why Hyunmin is so gung-ho on this to where again, I really don't think this is a good look for him to try so adamantly to get Huijong thrown in and eliminated first once again, to where we see him constantly campaigning for this, with Huijong even awkwardly walking in on this at a point. But this does lead to him putting more pressure onto Youngsuk, and by Youngsuk not going along with his plan, this leads to Hyungmin holding a grudge against him moving forward, which to me just felt like Hyungmin being very petty more than anything. But again, we get to the final bids where everything goes according to plan at first, with the suspense being focused on what is Youngsuk gonna do, which leads to an interesting reveal here, as again, it really diverts attention away from what is the actual suspense of this round, where we get the reveal that melons and strawberries end up selling for 4. Conveniently, the 2 fruits that Kyung-hoon and Ah-young both have, revealing that Kyung-hoon betrayed everybody. So we do get this great overhead shot of the reveal here, with everyone just looking at him while he's standing in the back alone, with him covering his face with his notepad. And again, we get some great reactions from everyone else, with this being kind of surprising to me that only Kyung-hoon ends up making this move. But obviously it's a very bold move here that puts a bullseye on his back moving forward, of him making him look like someone that isn't trustworthy, even though, again, that notion doesn't seem to actually harm him that much moving forward. But again, I do think this is a move that is largely misguided, as again, you already had a full plan set in place with your other allies that, again, would have kept you safe anyway. It's not like you were going to be thrown into the death match. And beyond that, it's funny how this move doesn't even fully work to his favor, where, again, he pretty much snipes the win for no real reason, as by making this move, he essentially screws over the person with the same fruit as him, which ends up being Ah-young, obviously, with her getting 0 for those fruits for this round. Again, screwing over his number 1 ally for very little benefit, and again, finally proving her fears true here. So we do get this typical over-dramatic flashback as we detail their relationship until we cut to Ah-young tripping, to which we get a record scratch, which again, perfectly fits into her character. But again, Kyung-hoon wins here, but the person he wanted to save the most ends up being the loser here, so he obviously can't give Ah-young immunity in this spot, and he ends up instead deciding to pick Kyungmin, which really comes out of nowhere, saying he did it because he needs a new alliance, because I guess now he's thinking of that. But Ah-young has to pick an opponent here, and she ends up picking Jury due to Ah-young being disappointed at her for flipping on her earlier, though also I'm sure her not being particularly threatening, especially amongst the potential nominees, to where she was always going to pick a watermelon here, to where, again, I definitely feel like that played a factor. But anyway, the deathmatch is revealed here to be Black and White 2, a game similar to Black and White, though using points instead of tiles, to where you start with 99 points. And again, it's a similar mechanic in how the game is functioned, though you can really pick any point number between 0 and 99, and if you use under 10, Black gets revealed, while if you use a double-digit number, White gets revealed, to where also we get a tower that demonstrates someone's total points, where it goes down in increments of 20, to where obviously, again, like Black and White, the first to 5 wins over 9 rounds wins, to where I think it's a really fun game. I actually really do love Black and White 2. It's actually one of my favorite death matches, to where, again, I think it adds a lot more complexity to the original format of Black and White. So again, there's so many factors to be thinking about here that it's really a game of wits, and you trying to outwit and try to outmaneuver what you think they're going to do, where, again, I really like this game. I'm actually kind of disappointed it didn't come back for grand final, where while I like the original Black and White as well, I do feel like it's still a game that is very rudimentary, especially in comparison to this version. But really, we don't end up seeing Ah-young and Jury playing this particularly well, where both of them end up using the exact same strategies, which again has both of them playing pretty suboptimally at points, though finally both of them end up being exactly tied after round 4, which seems like something that's actually pretty difficult to do. But we do end up seeing Ah-young go pretty big in round 5, winning with 28 points, with her kind of using a bit more points than what she needed to. They're also winning the following round 19 points in a spot where Jury only uses 18 for some reason. It does lead to Ah-young being in the lead 4-2, though only having 2 points left, with 3 rounds left in the game, with Jury having 10, meaning that Jury, if she played optimally here, could easily win the game here, to where had she used 3 for the remaining rounds, he ends up winning the game. But instead we see her play a bit too cute in round 7, where she ends up using only 1 point, where Ah-young uses the remainder for points, which I will say is a pretty decent move there. Again, catching Jury off guard, where I think the normal assumption would be that you're gonna not go all in until the final round, yet here we have Jury playing around that, only to obviously be wrong, costing her the game here. Again, I do find it really funny that even Ah Young was surprised at her winning this matchup. But anyway, we do lose Jury through this, which, I'll be honest, I think it was kind of fine. I mean, I think Jury is someone that did not seem like a particularly great player. I feel like she's someone that is definitely amongst the worst players in the history of the Genius. Not that she's that actively bad. I mean, she's just kind of fine. She just doesn't really do anything particularly well. In a spot where I think you can kind of tell that she doesn't really have the strategic mind for the Genius. I don't think there's ever really a point where she seems to be able to look at a game from a more critical lens. It feels like she's always kind of being led around by the people around her, where we even see her right away being scared of the fact that she has no inherent allies and decides to just jump onto someone else's ship and just essentially follow them from that point on. And while again, she puts on an admirable performance in Black and White 2, it was again against Ah Young, who doesn't play particularly well either. To where again, I don't think Jury's a particularly great player, but again, she at least had allies. She again almost beat Ah Young, but I also, again, don't really have much faith in her overall strategic ability, and again, when going from a TV perspective as well, she's not a particularly entertaining presence either. But anyway, we then move on to episode 2, where we do start off right away with Dongmin messing with Ah Young, calling her a murderer, already giving these Yunsun Hung Chul parallels here, or even goes on to mock her smirk that she gave after eliminating Jury, though Kyung-hoon ends up being saved for last, leading to a very awkward conversation between Kyung-hoon and Ah Young, with her being upset at him for not calling her Nuna anymore, to where he ends up giving her a Garnet for the emotional distress he caused her. Or just in general, the dynamic is very strange. But anyway, we get to the second main match, that being Jury Game. A game that's played with 7 citizens and 5 criminals, essentially being a social deduction game where the citizens need to figure out the criminals, though somehow they end up convoluting the game way beyond that, and adding in that the game is decided by a jury who is voted in by their fellow players, and this jury ends up having to vote for guilty or not guilty, where it has to be unanimous to be guilty, or if they get 3 guilty verdicts over 5 rounds, the citizens win, while otherwise the criminals win. But beyond that, they decide to also add in an aspect to the game of each side having a leader, which is kept secret from the others. But once the game is concluded, the losing team is given another way to potentially win in declaring who the other team's leader is, in a spot where the citizen leader knows all the criminals but the leader. But this ends up really just nullifying the bulk of this game, to where it obviously becomes a lot easier of a way to culminate this game, with the actual jury game not actually playing that much of a factor here, where yes, you can obviously get info through how a player votes when on the jury, and also again there's a 4-person that proposes jury combinations, so again you can get a lot of information through that, but really it feels like the bulk of this game is simply just social reads and you trying to figure out who the leader is, which makes the rest of the game kind of feel irrelevant, to where again jury game's not a game I particularly love, though I do think it plays out in a fun way here. But anyway, we do get our flash forward following this, showing Ah Young voting not guilty, making you think that she's a criminal, which in another flash forward I think effectively misleads you, though again I never felt like this was actually believable, as again I would not think that Ah Young would be capable of pulling off being a criminal like this. So obviously eventually the foreshadowing shifts to make you think of, is Ah Young gonna simp for Kyung-hoon instead, which is a bit more believable, but obviously still doesn't go through. But either way, we obviously see the players drawing for roles, for them being shown examples of what the cards look like, which is a response to the zombie game, which again, like to see the show learning off their previous mistakes. But Dongmin immediately calls out Kyung-hoon for being a criminal, along with Jung-hoon being called out by Young-sok of all people, but in general just being also too obvious here, where Jung-hoon ends up saying that actors are the worst at mafia, which again, you would think he would excel at that, but it does lead to the instant reveal that he is a criminal, with us learning right away, which is obviously played up for a humorous effect here, which in general, the criminals being picked here do not play this particularly well, to where while I think they're definitely at the disadvantage from the offset, I think the fact that 2 of them end up being caught right away ends up being a bad sign for their overall prospects here. But along with this, we also get the reveal that Huijong is a citizen, which felt like a pointless reveal here that doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't really add any suspense to anything, so I really don't understand why they did this here. But anyway, Yeonju ends up laughing as she leaves the room, with people saying that they think that she's a criminal, thus seeing Yohyun, Kanghyun, and Junghoon all instantly calling her out for being one, clearly being the criminals, trying to pick out anything they can to throw a citizen under the bus. Though with this, we do get an interesting strat from Dongmin, Dongmin, where he instantly calls a house meeting where he wants the citizen leader to secretly tell them who they are, to which obviously everyone just laughs at this, which again clearly is looked at as a joke at first, putting a lot of attention onto Dongmin here, though again I think it's actually an interesting move here that allows him to have these one-on-one conversations with the majority of the cast. Part of the reason why I do think the cast very much feels attached to him by the end of the game, but also allows for him to take further attention away from the leader, allowing them to fall more so into the background, with this actually leading to people thinking that he is the leader, trying to mask this through this plot. And again, we get some intrigue from this in that we see Jungbom pretending to be the citizen leader, though Dongmin instantly doesn't believe him, while Junghoon ends up admitting to him that he's the criminal, but not the leader, which is like, why are you saying that? As again, obviously one, now Dongmin's going to be watching you to see your other interactions with people to narrow down who the other criminals are, but also now it's easier to narrow down the leader as they know that you're not the leader. Anyway, we get to the game actually starting, where we do see them drawing for the 4-leader order, where most of the criminals end up being at the end here, which ends up obviously working against them once again, especially considering how quickly the citizens end up figuring out the game here, which essentially just ices them out from the offset. Though round 1 starts here with Yeonju as the first 4-person, though funnily they end up shutting down her team, with again many people thinking that she's actually a criminal, with Hyunmin being the next 4-person, to which he proceeds to ask Dongmin who he wants, which again I do like this as a tactic to make yourself look less like a leader, but him, Dongmin, Ah Young, and Hui Jung end up getting voted in here, obviously to where they all vote guilty. To where, to be fair, even if you are a criminal, I do feel like there is reason to not vote guilty right away, as you want to keep your cover, though really I feel like this is a game that, for the criminals in particular, I feel like you gotta be playing aggressively, considering how little opportunities there are for you to actually take the win here. But right away, we do get suspicion on Ah Young, with us even getting a nice bit of foreshadowing here, and us seeing her laughing after talking to Kyunghoon, after Kyunghoon tells her something, which really should have added more sus onto Kyunghoon, though again the show wants you to think that this is still Ah Young potentially being a criminal at this point. But either way, we get to round 2 where Yohyun is the 4-person, the only time a criminal ends up being the 4-person, to which he ends up just playing into what the majority wants, which to be fair, as a 4-person you kind of have to, as you still want your team to be voted in. So if again he is going to go against what everyone else wants, then obviously that jury's not going to be voted in, and through that again he essentially gets nothing out of this anyway. Though I do very much question more so what ends up happening after this, in that they end up still all voting guilty, to where again I do think he should have voted not guilty at this point. I think that was the move. For a while obviously it would have put a lot of sauce onto him. Again, that's really the only way that the criminals are going to win at this point. But it's here where we do also get an Ah Young fake out, only for him to just spill the entire game afterwards, revealing that Ah Young is actually a citizen, and us to literally get the reveal of every other criminal, us seeing Kyunghoon first, along with Jungbom, Yohyun, and Yeonsuk, with Yeonsuk also essentially being revealed as the leader here, which again was weird timing to just reveal the entire team, though obviously does highlight the severity of their situation for the criminals, who at this point are pretty screwed and essentially need help from the citizens to give them any chance here, to where we do see Kyunghoon asking both Ah Young and Dongmin for help, offering them garnets, though none of that ends up being particularly effective. To round 3 where the exact same thing happens, where we voted in the same people on the jury, just icing out the criminals, which even though the jury size ends up expanding over time, which I'm sure was to counter this notion, again it felt like the citizens had a good idea of what was going on here at this point. To which when this happens, we do see the criminals get together, thinking that all that's left of the game is to determine who the citizen leader is, leading to the critical mistake that ends up costing them the game. As we do get back to the voting, where it's revealed that all the citizens voted not guilty. Obviously now showing the Ah Young vote, which was previously implied earlier, where again it was portrayed as her betraying the citizens, when in reality it was actually a plan from the citizens, as they obviously now know that if they know the criminal leader, they can just end the game quickly here, vote not guilty, and end up picking the leader for the win. Where this is where we get the reveal of how they know who the leader is, where we get a flashback showing the critical mistake from the criminals here, and them seemingly forgetting the fact that the citizen leader knows all the criminals but the leader, meaning that as they walk away together, the citizen leader can dissect who the leader is, as it'll be the only person they weren't explicitly told about. So we see Hyungmin realize in this moment that Yeonsuk must be the leader of the criminals, which I've always liked this reveal and how it's edited here, it being presented in a very snappy way, and even beyond that, again, we proceed to also see more more flashbacks of Hyungmin playing this round particularly well, and now seeing him sucking up to the other criminals, having them all believe that he isn't the leader, to where again, it just really felt like he outplayed the criminal side in pretty much every facet of the game here, to where they had no real shot. But obviously following this, the talk ends up transitioning to who are they going to vote in, with Yeonsuk being the easy answer here, being the leader who is held responsible for the other team's loss, though we do also see Huijong and Dongmin struggling with this, due to the fact that he obviously saved them in the previous round. But again, Hyunmin ends up holding resentment for him over the previous game as well, where again, they end up voting Yeonsuk in anyway, in a spot where, like, to be fair, Yeonsuk was probably just going to be picked by whoever they picked for a deathmatch anyway, so in reality, this is probably just actually better for Yeonsuk and giving him the option of going in against who he wants to, where Yeonsuk ends up picking Kyunghoon here, saying it's his best chance of survival, which, questionable. I mean, Junghoon seemed like the weakest of the bunch here, where I feel like I would have the most faith in beating him some sort of match, but Kyunghoon did burn people in the previous game, which I assume he thought would lead to him having less in personal connections. If that played a factor into the death match, which, what do you know, it does, as the second death match ends up being betting rock, paper, scissors. A game that I always personally liked, it being a mixture of Winning Streak and Sun Moon Star, where, like Winning Streak, one player will be playing rock, paper, scissors against a non-deathmatch player, with you getting chips if you win against them, adding in this social strategy aspect here, and you having to get information from your fellow players and what symbols they choose. But like Sun Moon Star, there's a betting component added to this, in that the other deathmatch player is going to be able to bet on the results of that matchup, making this a much more tactical game than either of the games that inspired this one, where it's simply not enough just knowing what your fellow opponents picked and winning those matchups, but you also have to read your opponents on if they're going to win or lose, or try to make them bet in the wrong way. And as a whole, I really like this game. I think it's probably one of the series' best death matches, though this version in particular does have a fatal flaw with it that gets exploited that, again, can make the final result of this particular appearance a bit underwhelming, though. In the lead up to it, we do get a lot of focus around the Ah-young Kyunghoon relationship, with romantic music playing as we get footage of Kyunghoon's first interview and him talking about how attractive he finds Ah-young, which in general, I will say, I do like that aspect of the season, the fact that we have these like interviews from the players preseason of them saying like the dossiers of the other players, where again, seeing their initial reactions to the cast was kind of cool. But yeah, and we see him also like asking her if she has a boyfriend, him being happy and confessional that she doesn't, to where I do believe that they actually did end up dating for a short period after the show, so again, good on him, I guess. So supposedly that ended on rocky terms, but again, they try to make it seem like she isn't going to tell Kyunghoon her information, only for the later reveal that she obviously does, to where really everyone ends up helping Kyunghoon here, with everyone seeming to look at Yeonsuk as the biggest threat, though most do end up telling both, despite the fact that they're rooting for Kyunghoon in this instance, where we do see Yeonsuk really strong-arming people for information that ends up being effective, though isn't a particularly good look for him, souring him on people even more, though the only person to not outright tell Kyunghoon their information ends up being Huijong, leading to a humorous moment of Huijong saying, "I'll cheer for you," and Kyunghoon leaving saying, "Don't cheer for me then." But anyway, the deathmatch starts with Kyunghoon ending up guessing correctly for Huijong's pick anyway, all while we do see Yeonsuk early on deciding to draw on purpose to see what happens, which it's revealed that essentially nothing happens. Will obviously be important down the road. So again, clearly that felt like an oversight when creating this game, but and we do see Kyunghoon holding an initial lead, only for him to make a misstep and betting on lose, thinking that Yohyun didn't tell Yeonsuk about his choice, only for a reveal that Yeonsuk actually heard Yohyun tell Kyunghoon his choice when walking in on their conversation, putting Kyunghoon at a deficit that Yeonsuk proceeds to be able to exploit, as we get this big dramatic moment towards the end of the match and Kyunghoon deciding to go all in after doing any mini miny mo, which again would have potentially won him the game, only for Yeonsuk to reveal that he tied it once again, being this big reveal that Yeonsuk essentially broke the game here, and realizing that once you have a lead, you can simply just tie every single time, making it impossible for Kyunghoon to get any points, which is again a very effective strat at the very end of the game, essentially being game over for Kyunghoon here. And obviously with that, we lose Kyunghoon, who, again, was a great character on this season. Probably one of the biggest characters on this season. Where, again, I think that's probably my biggest flaw of this season, the fact that I think it's a bit lacking in terms of characters. Yeah, I feel like Kyunghoon obviously was a massive one here, when that obviously they bring him back for grand final, despite the fact that he's the second boot on this season, where, again, he clearly made an impact here. Again, I think his betrayal and fruit stand is still one of the best moments of the entire season. I think just in general, his very weird Dodo-ish quality definitely made him a really fun character. And again, he definitely has some skill to him. I mean, as we see in grand final, again, it's not like he brings nothing to the table game-wise, though obviously most of his play on this season ends up being particularly sloppy, though even then, again, considering the fact that he betrayed pretty much the entire house in the previous round, he actually comes into this round still having people like him and still wanting to work with him, despite how untrustworthy he is. Where, again, I think that means for something, where Kyung-hoon, again, despite the fact that, again, maybe a bit questionable of a person outside the show, with him having definitely some controversies around him, I think as a TV presence, I think he was definitely one of the best casting choices of this season. And now for episode 3, which straight up ends up being one of the more lackluster episodes of the season, with us getting a pretty uninteresting opening sequence to the episode outside of all the focus around how after this episode there'll be 3 black garnets in the game, meaning that a twist can finally actually matter, I guess. But anyway, we get the reveal that the third main match of the season ends up being Middle Race. Probably the most complicated game the Genius has ever created, to the point where I know the players themselves supposedly hated this game, considering how it took forever to conclude just due to how much it was involved with actually playing the game. But in this game, each player will move spaces on a board using cards 1 through 4 on them to determine how far they will go, with these cards getting reset once their hands are empty. But an interesting twist to a normal races, this is a game where you actually don't want to finish first, in that the person who actually finishes first is actually a loser, alongside the last place finisher, again shaking up what you would typically expect from a typical race, especially considering there's also an extra bonus for coming in 2nd and 10th, where you also get a black garnet to add more black garnets into the game, giving you incentive to play again a bit more risky here, and again teetering on the line of potentially coming in first or last. But what makes this even more interesting is the fact that each player will be given one of 11 roles, each with different abilities, with the majority of them interacting with each other, which obviously leads to the billion steps for every turn that ends up extending the length of this match. But I did find that actually the way that these roles are drafted to actually be somewhat interesting here, and that the draft order actually comes from the results of a safety chain, which has obviously become a prominent fixture in modern reality shows, where I felt like every reality show was doing it for a while as a twist, though I actually did not remember that the Genius actually did it in this position years before it became the norm, though obviously here simply just to determine the draft order more so than an actual elimination. Really, the draft order obviously becomes very important considering how imbalanced many of these roles end up being, but we do actually get an additional auction for the right to pick first, with Ah Young easily winning that. He proceeds to not know what to do with it, though we do end up getting a private vote to determine who starts the chain, and in turn is obviously the last to pick their role, with it easily going to Yeonsuk, with Yeonsuk instantly picking Hyunmin to continue their rivalry, who then picks Yeonsung to spur their rivalry. The chain ends up culminating in Jungbom picking between Huijong and Sujin, with Sujin winning the top spot here, where I felt like she was pretty much the chalk pick coming into this, where just no one dislikes her being a largely affable figure, though I will say I was pretty surprised that Huijong made this far into the chain. But anyway, we get to the role selection, which again with this we might as well talk about the roles as we go through each person. Where do you see Ah Young picking delete, which allows her to delete all but one card from someone's hand when she's moved, a powerful ability that is pretty versatile here, as it can be used offensively against an opponent by leaving them with only high cards, but also can be used defensively by allowing someone to keep a low card, and once that card is used, obviously it allows them to reset once again, where, again, this could be very useful, definitely in conjunction with other skills, and in general, it's a pretty solid first pick. But then we get Sujin picking Gravity, an ability that allows you to discard a card to pull an enemy towards you, another pretty powerful ability that can be used to help your allies and better their positions, though can also be used on your enemies and holding them back, to where, in conjunction with other skills, this becomes infinitely more powerful, to a point where it's kind of broken, as we'll see, which in general is kind of the thing with this game, is that so many skills end up overlapping with each other, to where I would not be surprised if the producers themselves did not realize what some of these combinations end up doing. Next up we get Huijong, who ends up picking Silence, an ability that allows him to disable another player's ability until the next round, another powerful ability with a lot of versatility, but one that seems to boon people in your alliance more so than you as an individual, as one, it's kind of you making enemies, so you constantly having to choose people to disable, but again, it can be powerful in the sense that you can use it to bargain with people, though again, I don't think that's really worth the consequence. But finally, we get Jungbum, who ends up picking With, which is another pretty powerful ability to where when he's down to only one card, he can actually pick another player to move alongside him, which in conjunction with deletes can obviously be a very powerful ability where he can technically use this every single time his cards are deleted. Though at the same time, I do think this comes off as very circumstantial, but like a lot of these other better cards, can be used effectively, both offensively and defensively, where you can obviously move a player with you to get them first, though otherwise obviously you can help your allies in taking them with you if they need to get further on the board, but I don't feel like that aspect of the ability is nearly as powerful. We then get to Yeonju, who ends up picking Reset, another pretty powerful ability here, one that allows her, whenever she's moved backwards, to reset anybody's hand, which can be very beneficial, obviously, for the other players and giving them a lot of versatility in how they move, though at the same time, it's another one that I don't think really benefits Yeonju in particular that much outside of gaining favor with people. But then we get to Junghoon, who picks Mirror, which I will say I am actually kind of surprised that no one picked Mirror up to this point, as this ends up being a pretty powerful ability, another one that's kind of broken, to where if moved by an ability, Mirror can actually move another player in the opposite direction, which again is a pretty powerful skill here, to where in conjunction with a lot of other abilities, it really just allows Junghoon to just skyrocket someone into first, or can skyrocket someone into last. So again, alongside Gravity, I feel like this is one of the more important roles in the game. But then we have Yuhyun, who ends up picking Quick, a really weird skill that like doubles the amount of movements from 2 of the cards in your hand, but the other 2 cards will be used to make you go backwards, which again, if I'm a player picking this, I feel like I actually kind of like it, as it's a role that doesn't actually interact much with the others, to where also, again, the different combinations of which 2 cards to use for which ability can lead to a lot of versatility and how exactly you utilize this skill. But at the end of the day, obviously, it's a skill that has you largely playing on your own for the bulk of the game. But then we move on to Dongmin, who picks 1, a card that allows you to move forward or backwards 1 spot whenever a 1 is used during another player's turn. Again, another mostly independent role here that doesn't really have the power to make any big moves in the game, to where again it's a largely inoffensive role here. But then we get to Yunsung, who ends up picking Union, which ends up being a completely broken ability, where it's an ability that pulls any player 1 spot ahead of you to your spot, which we obviously see gamed later on, where in conjunction with other skills, it can essentially force you, the player that picked Union, to be pushed all the way back to the very beginning of the board, making this a skill pretty primed to come in last, to where we do see them later fix this skill, where they make the skill voluntary. Again, in its current form, where you're forced to utilize the skill, it is really broken. I think it's something that was clearly an oversight from the game designers. But then we get to Hyunmin, who ends up picking Push, a role that I'm kind of surprised was saved for this late, considering how important of a role this ends up being. Though it's also probably the bane of most people's existence in this game, as this is the skill that pretty much made the games go on for as long as they do, with it interacting with so many other skills that it became annoying to play with. Though it's a skill that essentially can't be on the same space as any other character, meaning that if there is a character on the same space as this one, it would have to be pushed forward or backwards 1 spot, which again just led to so many interactions, would be so annoying to deal with. But finally we get to Yunsok, who is left with Jump, by far the worst skill in the game, one that literally jumps over spaces with other pieces, essentially meaning that Jump is almost always going to be in first place. Now, to reconcile this, they do end up giving him a 0 card, and also allows him to reset when he's down to only 2 cards, but that's simply not enough to make this a more balanced skill, where, again, considering the later loophole that gets found out as well, it just makes it very easy to make this person come in first, to where it does feel like whoever gets Jump is essentially screwed from the offset, with them just being pushed to the very front almost every single time they're playing. But anyway, following this, we do get the flash forward of the episode, where 3 hours later we see Hyungmin saying this game is cruel, all while Yeonju is crying, and Yunsok saying that I'm losing my taste for this, which is a quote from Gura in season 1. But again, clearly trying to make it seem like Hyunmin is losing here. That's the reason why Yeonju is emotional, and in reality, it's pretty much the opposite. Which again, decent use of a flash forward there. But right away, we do see Dongmin pulling over Sujin, Junghoon, Ayoung, and Jungbom, saying that they're the center of this game and wants them for an alliance, where obviously using Gravity and Mirror together can just easily get someone into first. Oh, well, we also get talk about using delete and width to do a similar thing, allowing someone to move alongside Jungbom for every single round. So the game does start where we do see Aoyang and Jungbom enact that strategy, and we also get some humor from Huijong getting a bit power hungry here, threatening his silence ability, the strong arm Jungbom to take him with him, as again, obviously initially this is a good thing. Obviously that later turns once we get a bit closer to the end of the board, but again, right away clearly you can tell just how many interactions there are, with it just really overcomplicating this game to where we even see the dealer getting overwhelmed with how much she has to keep track with. But along the way, we do get the realization from Yunsong, and really most of the players, that Push's power goes before Union, to where there is a predetermined order for each character here that does end up actually playing a pretty major factor in how these roles operate, which essentially makes the Union power much worse, in it upending a plan that Hyunmin had initially put together to work alongside Union, and instead realize that Union and Push can essentially be used in a loop together, which can allow them to utilize skills over and over again, as we do see like Delete being used over and over again, and we later see Yeonju getting infinite resets and resetting a good chunk of players, which, to be fair, again, I think was a complete oversight from a game development standpoint, as, again, this is kind of broken to use your ability over and over and over again over the course of a single turn, though. Also, we do get a pretty funny subplot through this of, like, Yunsong constantly wanting Yeonju to reset him, and her getting many opportunities to do so, only for to never actually pick him, which leads to his frustration, but eventually players do get a break here to talk strat, but during this, Hyunmin seems to realize the optimal strat for this game, realizing that he can essentially just completely isolate Yunsong here through their combination, realizing that they can obviously use a loop between Union and Push to pull them all the way back to the back of the pack, while then also using gravity to then pull Push all the way back to the front, essentially guaranteeing that Yunsong will come in last. Again, showing Union's ability working against itself, which again shows how broken of ability it is when it is involuntary. Although Yunsuk becomes the very clear target to come in first, with us getting the reveal that almost everyone voted Yunsuk in, even Huijong and Dongmin, who were supposedly working with him in the previous round, with lots of talk about needing to get someone out with a black Garnet, which, I'll be honest, I don't really understand why that's the case. As what difference does it really make? As, again, there's going to be enough black Garnets for it to be utilized no matter what anyway. But once the game continues, we do see Huijong actually feeling bad about targeting Yunsuk and ends up silencing his ability, which is actually good for him, to where it ends up kind of delaying the game even more, to where we actually get another break following this pretty quickly, with essentially nothing happening in that time in between, which again really just shows you how long this game is taking to finish. Though during this, Hyunmin does realize the loophole in the jump ability, and that it only resets when Yunsuk has only 2 cards remaining in his hand, not when he has 1 card, meaning that he is extremely susceptible to the delete ability, which obviously could work for him if she ends up leaving him like a 0 or a 1, but obviously they intend on making him come in first, so where obviously they're going to leave him with a 4, really icing him out of the game here, to where once the game continues, we see Aoyang obviously enact this strategy, using her delete ability on Yunsuk, all while we see the other players cover the empty spaces on the board, meaning that Yunsuk essentially jumps over all of them and ends up losing the game, with him being upset at how heartless they were. To which again, Yunsuk ends up being extremely bitter for the rest of this episode. So now, obviously, we get the race for second, with Yohyun and Huijong end up being the closest to that, with Hyungmin being in a position where he can really enable one of the two and ends up asking them for Garnets. Although Yunsuk is annoyed in the background at how Hyunmin is delaying the game, but eventually Yuhyun ends up coming in second, all while Yunsung obviously gets pulled to the back as expected. This does lead to Yeonju being in the position where she could potentially save Yunsung through resetting him, leading to the moment from the flash forward of Yunsung and Hyunmin arguing over this, and Youngsuk saying he's losing his taste over this, all while Yeonju is struggling with this decision, though obviously she decides to not help Yunsung here, and he does end up coming in last, after Sujin obviously uses her gravity ability to leave him solely in the back, with her also ending up being in 10th, where she also gets an extra black Garnet out of this. But again, obviously we get a Yunsung death match, which again is really lame that this entire game was again so gameable, to where a big majority could easily form and really just ice out 2 other players, which again was not interesting to see. Though I will say we do get a decent death match here, and it being the return of Black and White 2, the only other time Black and White 2 returns, which again I think is kind of underwhelming. But again, this ends up being an interesting game here, where we do see Yunsuk playing very aggressively at the beginning here, like instantly starting by using 20, though again at least the Yunsuk just using 0, which is kind of the issue with using big points like that early on, where And we get a lot of talk here about needing to lose by big margins with Yeonsuk, again, playing this all wrong initially, really wasting a lot of points here. Though, to be fair, Yeonsuk does proceed to essentially do the exact same thing following this, to where they do come into the final round being tied 4-4, though Yeonsuk proceeded to also blow a lot of his points in the lead up to that, particularly in the penultimate round, to where Yeonsuk's early wins allows him to be a bit more conservative towards the end, leading to him still having 25 points coming to the final round to Yeonsuk's 1, to where Yeonsuk ends up pretty easily winning here, to which I think was an overall pretty solid performance from Yeonsuk. Despite him, again, kind of wasting some points along the way, I do feel like he ended up demolishing a pretty formidable foe in this spot. But anyway, with that, we do lose Yeonsuk, who, I mean, seemed like a player that didn't really have much of a shot in this season. Seemed like someone that was just instantly talked about as a massive threat on the board and was constantly on the bottom the entire time, to where, while, again, he seemed to be fine in Fruit Stand, I mean, following that, he was pretty much on the bottom the rest of the way. I mean, he was someone that was obviously thrown into elimination in episode 2, with many people looking at him as threatening there, and him having, again, less help than Kyung-hoon in betting rock, paper, scissors, all while he is like the consensus target for this round, where everyone is trying to get him into the death match and easily do so, to where, again, I felt like he was someone that never really got his footing in the game, never really felt like had that much potential, to where while he did get some allies at points, again, none of them really stuck, to where I will say I do think some of that comes from the fact that obviously Yeonsuk maybe isn't the greatest socially in the world. I do think he really comes off as very domineering at points, and that kind of turns people away. Yeah, I do think, again, there also is some probably outside of the game circumstances that's affecting his game, but really as a whole, again, a lackluster player here. One that did have, again, minor moments of brilliance. Again, I did like his strategy of drawing in betting rock, paper, scissors. So like Gura, I think he kind of had this more like defeatist attitude towards the end that kind of felt like he just kind of lost interest in playing the game, to where, again, he kind of goes out in a pretty underwhelming way here. But either way, with that, we move on to episode 4, where this ends up being another just kind of okay episode. Definitely better than episode 3, but probably more in line with episode 2, though maybe not as good considering it has a more lackluster death match. But anyway, the episode does start with Youngsung and Yohyun being the first to enter, where we get the reveal here that Youngsung has 0 garnets because he gave all of them to Yohyun before the death match last week, revealing that the players have already countered the new format by just handing over their garnets to someone else, which, to be fair, is only allowed before they're officially declared as the deathmatch candidate, but it kind of shows how pointless this format change was to begin with. But with that, we also get Dongmin coming in and having this gimmick of being a waiter and guiding people around as they enter. And he also proceeds to also make a joke in this opening section that doesn't really sit right with me, and him, again, joking about how dark Youngsung's skin's getting, and him saying that he's going to look like Will Smith, which, again, just not a fun thing to be joking around about. But anyway, we get to the 4th main match, which ends up being Sword and Shield, which finally, during the explanation for this, we get Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag music playing during it, which has always been jarring to me. But again, it ends up being another game played in teams here, where it's another game where you have to find out who the other team's leader is, which I find it very strange how they essentially utilize a similar style of game 2 times in the first 4 episodes of this season, where, while obviously not exactly the same, they do require pretty similar skills, but obviously the way the game is played here ends up being very different, in that they essentially end up playing out a battle here with each player being given 2 weapons, one for the left hand and one for the right hand, that are initially hidden, with there being 4 different weapon types, which all have different abilities, with swords being able to do 1 damage, dual swords being able to do 2 damage, while shields can defend against 3 attacks, while also bare hands have no ability. But each team is obviously only given a certain amount of each weapon, allowing the other team to narrow down who has which weapon, which, with you wanting to defend your leader, it can lead to this obviously having you get info about who the leader is. But also, an interesting aspect of all this is that you can also lie about what weapon you have and which ones you're attacking or defending with, to which, even if you're lying about that weapon, it still ends up being utilized as if you do, unless you're doubted. In that case, if you lie, you're going to be exposed and also be eliminated from the game, though if you incorrectly doubt, you are eliminated from the game, which, again, I think adds a really interesting dynamic to this game, where I think there are points where, despite the fact that you are wrong, can be effective, as obviously forces the other player to reveal their weapon, which gives you more pieces of the logic puzzle to figure out who exactly has what, and through that, again, can logic out who the leader is, where, again, I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics added to this game. So I like this game on paper. I will say I don't think it leads to the best TV though, where again this is a game that could just very easily be finished very quickly, as we actually see, where if you're only playing out one round of this game, it is very easy to just eliminate the leader from the very beginning, as we see both sides proceed to essentially do. And I also don't love how it's another game that has essentially most of the house being immune following it, where obviously the winning team here ends up being safe, but along with that, we also have them being given an extra token of immortality to give to somebody, which I don't get why they felt like that was necessary, as I don't believe they've done that in previous seasons, to where, I mean, I get the notion of, okay, this incentivizes people to betray their teams, gives them a reason to do so, but again, I also don't love how it really narrows down the options to go into the deathmatch to only 4, while also kind of makes it too easy to win this game, where obviously if you do get someone to flip, they would obviously just tell you who the leader is, and that's just game over, to where again, that's not particularly interesting either. So again, I think the season kind of starts off with too many of these sort of matches that has like too much of just groups working together, as we see obviously in the jury game, where the house was essentially split in half because of just how that game was designed, along with the middle race, where again, it's just incentivized the big majority alliance to form, where while again, I do think the game design of this season ends up being way more complicated than that of previous seasons, and the games themselves are just more interesting. I do think these early games in particular are ones that really just incentivize these big groups to form. That's not that fun to see. But anyway, here we do see the teams be decided here by a schoolyard pick, the one that is started by the winners of middle race, which is a weird way to handle this. But through that, we have Yohyun and Sujin as the captains, where as they draft the teams, we do see Ah-young instantly saying that she knows she's going to be picked last. And what do you know? She's picked last, which ends up being a funny moment there. She like falls to the ground, though. Really, the teams here end up being split into essentially celebs versus non-celebs, with Yohyun getting most of the normal people and getting Jungbom, Hyungmin, Youngsang, and obviously Ah-young by default by the end. But Sujin ends up picking a lot of celebrities, and Dongmin, Yeonju, and Junghoon, while Huijong also is at least a returning player, I guess. So again, it felt like that was a very celeb-based team, which in essence is also just a reunion of all the previous watermelons from round 1. Just like in that round, they get pretty much completely outplayed here. But anyway, we see the team leader be picked through random draw, and the teams now have to divvy out weapons, where we do instantly see some interesting strats coming from both sides, with Youngmin realizing the strength about lying about your weapon to conceal who has what, while also talking about the benefits of not giving the leader both shields. That would make it too obvious, and the other team would be able to suss out who has the shields based on who doesn't have the shields, where again, I feel like Youngmin clearly figures out how to play this game right off the bat. Though I did find it interesting that the show does instantly reveal that Youngsang is the leader of his team, while also they decide to conceal the leader of the other team, which should have made it very obvious that the other team was going to be the losing team, as why else conceal that outside for a big reveal for later. But anyway, Dongmin does have an interesting strat here of pretending that Yeonju is the leader and wanting her to do some method acting, only for Yeonju to not even understand the basic rules of the game, leading to some frustration from him. But we do get to see the other team instantly sussing out Huijong with talk about how he's acting differently, having more adrenaline right now. And we later also hear them talk about a tell of his, and that he perked up at the notion of being saved by Black Garnet, to where, again, it felt pretty clear that they already sussed Huijong from the very beginning. Oh, while we do see Youngsang also making a bit of a misstep here and going to Dongmin and offering to switch over, which felt very unnatural for Youngsang to be doing, which leads to Dongmin suspecting him from the very beginning. But we do see some talk about trying to pull over someone from the other side, with Dongmin talking about wanting to pull Hyungmin over with the promise of a token, though Hyungmin realizes that this will probably happen, where he ends up planning on spreading false info if this plan went through, though it doesn't. So again, that led to nothing. But anyway, the game does start with us getting the reveal that the first to successfully doubt will get a Black Garnet, adding to the incentive to doubt, which can lead to interesting results. No, also leads to a quicker game, but also ends up adding in more Black Garnets to the game, obviously, with us already getting talk now about how the loser should have the backing of their team and be able to go to a Black mission, which already starts to lessen the stakes of the main match. But anyway, Ah-young is the first to attack here, to where we finally see her not know if it's a sword or a blade, leading to Huijong joking about why this was why she wasn't picked, leading to her attacking Huijong, being kind of funny that he becomes the initial target because he made a joke to Ah-young. Though, to be fair, again, he had sauce on him anyway. But anyway, Dongmin is next, to where we do see him use his dual swords on Yeonsang, which really ends up shocking his team, where Jungbom ends up doubting it right away, only for it to be revealed to be true, with Dongmin now being even more confident Youngsung being the leader, as why else would Jungbom doubt in that situation, unless he was protecting the leader in that spot. But through that, again, both leaders end up being the initial targets here, with both teams just attacking them at every turn, with all this leading up to Yu-hyun using dual swords on Huijong, with Dongmin thinking that he's lying, all while Huijong says that he's too sure of himself, to where they decide to not doubt there, despite the fact that Yu-hyun was lying, which Huijong decides to defend with his right shield, which has him lying in this spot, with Ah-young doubting this, as they kind of have to, as if they don't, then Yeonsung would die in the following round, revealing that Huijong was lying, leading to him being eliminated, with the reveal now in flashback that obviously Huijong was the leader, because obviously, where again, this game ends up ending pretty quickly with Huijong's team losing, leading to us spending a lot of time in this episode on the winning team discussing who to give the token to and who to throw in, where Huijong instantly talks about wanting to go into a deathmatch with Dongmin, as they were the ones responsible for everything, which is kind of demeaning to his team, and him talking about how irrelevant they essentially were. But we do get some fun from Dongmin in refusing to make a deal with the other side, saying that he's confident he'll win the deathmatch or Black Mission, and essentially threatens them here, which, I mean, to be fair, is not good gameplay in the slightest. But again, clearly Huijong's getting voted in here, with them out of the blue giving the token of immortality to Sujin, which again is never really explained, especially considering Youngju seemed to be someone that was willing to make a deal with them for Garnets. Yeah, again, that doesn't seem to go anywhere. But when we get to Huijong's pick, we do see him say that he was going to pick Dongmin until he felt anger from how the other side was so happy, and he doesn't want to do what they want in picking Dongmin, so he picks Junghoon instead, which I personally feel like he was probably going to do the entire time. Again, he does claim that this was something spurred on by the other side being happy, but in reality, I feel like it made no sense for him to pick Dongmin to begin with. Again, it's taking out his number one ally in the game, and also someone that he works extremely well with. Also someone that's probably going to be a tougher competitor in the deathmatch, to where, again, I think it makes a lot of sense for him picking Junghoon here. So I don't love how much he's trying to pretend like this is a thing that he's doing simply to spite the other team. Anyway, it's in this spot where we do see Junghoon using Black Garnets to play in a Black Mission. The first Black Mission we get to see, and who would have guessed it's boring. But again, he gets Garnets from Sujin, Ah-young, and Youngsung, with the hope that he would end up throwing in Dongmin if he won, which, again, won't happen. But again, he ends up picking Observation here, which ends up essentially being a one-person game of Go Hap, having to find all combos in 100 seconds, which we end up playing this sequence out in real time, which I thought was a pretty interesting editing choice from the genius, where you rarely see something not being completely over edited. But we do proceed to see him finishing early with plenty of time left on the clock that he could have used to double check, only for the reveal that he obviously missed one, finally being the first one that I even saw when looking at the boards. I don't know how he missed it, but again, he loses the Black Mission, nothing happens. This was pretty boring. So again, even beyond just the twist not working and that being a failure, just watching him play Go Hap is not interesting in the slightest either. And what do you know, we follow the death match, which is another pretty boring match to watch, that being double-sided poker. A new game, kind of, obviously being a modification of Indian poker, but with each card having two different sides, and with each card having two sides, and you can bet on both the front and the back, in a spot where only the player themselves will know what's on the back of their card, with us giving the option of being able to bet on both sides, though if that is the case, both sides of your card need to be better than the side that your opponent bet on, though if you win that matchup, you get an additional 10 coins. Again, just a new thing to add to the standard poker formula. Really outside that, it's not a particularly innovative version of it, and really as a whole, it plays out just like the other versions of poker, which is not fun. So again, I think poker, while again a solid death match, from a competitive standpoint, I don't think it makes for particularly good TV. Where outside of the Jinho Gura death match and also the one between G1 and Jinho, that was just complete luck. I don't feel like poker's ever made for particularly good TV. But again, here we get the matchup between Huijong and Junghoon, where we do see Huijong playing pretty aggressively off the bat, making pretty big bets, which really is not the way to play these sort of games, where I feel like the poker variations on the Genius very much benefit you making very small bets and playing a very consistent game, though Huijong kind of goes against that. And again, it's also a match that just keeps on going on and on and on. Just, it's pretty boring. And what do you know, at the end of the game, we get the reveal that Junghoon has been counting cards. What an innovative idea. So yeah, Jung-hoon wins. With that, we obviously lose Huijong. Where I will say, I did feel bad for Huijong going out in this spot, where obviously Huijong was the first boot of season 2, and see him come back here, again, was a very interesting prospect. I thought he had a lot of potential, and to be fair, we did see some of that at points, but really, I think this run kind of solidifies the fact that Huijong's probably not the greatest player in the world. I mean, he is someone that definitely is very prone to getting very cocky in the game. He's someone that definitely has some poor reads in the game at points, too, to where really, I mean, his loss in Sword and Shield really comes down to him not doubting Yohyun when he should have, in a spot where Dongmin was literally telling him the correct move to make and he still didn't do it, to where while Huijong obviously has a very high IQ and is someone that seems very poised to do well in the Genius, I think there is something like just fundamentally missing there, to where he's not really meant for the game, though again, I was definitely underwhelmed to see him go out in this spot, in a spot where again, it felt like he kind of went out in a bit of a whimper here. But now moving on to episode 5, where right away we see Huijong's Garnet getting distributed to his former team, being kind of funny that instead of the deathmatch winner getting the Garnets, now the previously eliminated player can just request where the Garnets go, which again feels like the premise of this format change going against them here, with at least in the previous format, the person who gets the Garnets being someone that did something to get them, where here it feels like Garnets can be distributed willy-nilly just to anyone that has a decent relationship with the eliminated player. But either way, eventually the dealers obviously come out as normal, to where this is the first time we do see Dongmin doing his now signature call out to the dealer saying friend, to which he obviously never responds to him. But anyway, we get to the 5th main match, that being Minor Game, a game played in teams of 3, which are picked randomly, which don't get why we're doing it now when we get so many drafts beforehand, but weirdly, it's still an individual game despite that, where while they will be in teams to mine minerals, they will still be playing the game individually, where there is a bidding portion to this game, to where when it is not their turn to mine, they get to bid on how much they want to take from the mining team, where there are a number of minerals offer differing point amounts, and if the total points bid is lower than what was pulled from the mine, then you will get the points that you bid. But if the total bid is over what the miners got, then the miners will get the points that they mined, all while the bidders will get nothing, that is, except for the lowest bidder, where in this spot, the highest bidder will end up losing what they had bid and will have to give those points to the lowest bidder, being this massive punishment for bidding too high. That obviously adds a risk to trying to get too many points here, though another interesting aspect of this game is the addition of bombs, which if you end up mining 3 bombs, no miners will end up getting points, but the points that the bidders declared are rewarded to them, to where, again, I do like how complex this system of getting points is, where there are just so many ways to get and lose points, to where I will say I do think a critique of this game is how random the actual mining can be, to where while they could stop at any time and draw as many minerals as they want, there initially obviously doesn't seem to be a trick to this game, and even the one that we get revealed later on is one that I do kind of wonder if it was really intentional from the producers. But I don't love how luck-based the mining aspect of the game seems to be, though again, obviously, there is still some strategy to how much you end up mining, but overall, again, I do still really like this game and just how many layers there are to it, and it finally being a game that doesn't incentivize working in big groups, which was really what the last 3 main matches were, where here, even within your teams, the person with the most points ends up getting garnets, so you're not even incentivized to work within your own group, to where again, I do like how individualistic this game ends up being a nice change of pace from how the last few games played out. But here we do see the teams get picked, to where Yohyun, Junghoon, and Hyunmin end up being Team 2, which is instantly looked at as the strongest team of the bunch, all while Dongmin ends up being on Team 3, alongside Sujin and Ah-young, with him being annoyed at that pairing, considering how clearly they come off as the weakest team of the bunch, all while Team 1 ends up being kind of just normal, and it being Jambam, Yeonju, and Yeonsung. Really, they get largely overshadowed in this episode, but here we do see Yohyun talk about wanting to work with Jungbom and then want to pull in Dongmin into their group as well, so that they have one person from each team to help each other out. interesting strategy here to show how important these relationships outside of your own teams are going to matter here, only for Dongmin to turn this deal down, as there are only 2 tokens of life, to where they really don't end up giving him that much incentive to be working alongside him. Now, again, straight up, Dongmin could lie and pretend to work with them and gain the benefits of that, then not actually follow through with everything, as again, they don't even promise him immunity in this spot. They really just promise him black garnets, which is not that much of a help, which I will say is a flaw in how they pitched this argument, though I will also say, again, Dongmin ideally probably would have at least entertained this thought, but anyway, the game does start, and right away we do see Dongmin analyzing the cubes, to where you can clearly tell he realizes something here, though obviously that doesn't get revealed until a bit later. But the challenge as a whole does have a bit of a slower start here, with teams playing pretty conservatively, though we do see Sujin falling a bit behind on the offset, being the only one to bid big, all while Team 2 ends up stopping early, costing her points there. But once we get to Team 3's turn, we get more foreshadowing in Dongmin's later reveal, with him being able to pick out a bomb and smiling when he does, though we do get some bickering between him and Ah-Young, with him telling Ah-Young not to grab too many, as they don't want to get a bomb, only for her to obviously grab a bomb. Which, in general, I do find the overall dynamic between Dongmin and Ah-Young just very strange, to where it does feel like inherently misogynistic in nature, and the fact that he really seems to talk down to the likes of Ah-Young and Yeonju quite a bit on this season. So obviously, they don't seem to take it too personally, and again, it ends up being turned into these more comical moments on the show, to where again, I do as a whole find it to be fun content for the show, even though I do feel like it definitely could be perceived in a more negative way. But following this round, we see Dongmin finally pull over Ah-Young and Sujin and reveal to them that he's found out the trick, and that is that the weights of the cubes are different. Him saying that the bombs are heavier, which again is this reveal here that is cool at first. Again, it very much feels like this like open pass moment. It feels like God's judgment. Again, this big trick to this game. But it's also one that, again, I don't know how intentional this is. As again, by the way the voiceover talks about this reveal, it makes it seem like this is kind of just a happy accident, and the fact that we get the reveal that bombs are made of ebony, all while the other cubes are made of maple, and through doing so, ebony weighs double the weight of maple, which again just makes it sound like this is just a consequence of the material they decided to utilize, and it's something that they didn't really take that much into consideration, as we do see them even say that it's something that not many people will notice. And even when other people figure this out later on, we do see a lot of people struggling with even being able to dissect the two, to where, again, it makes it very much feel like this is just an accident than anything that was meant to actually impact the game. But following round one, we do see Hyungmin being in the lead, with Yoo-hyun initially talking about wanting to back Hyunmin to get the token of life from him, only to catch Hyunmin and Dongmin already talking, which we don't get the context of that, which I wonder if that'll matter down the road, which in general, and we do get a lot of foreshadowing between Hyungmin and Dongmin through this episode, which does make the later reveal pretty satisfying and how much it was set up. The following this conversation, we do see Hyungmin tell the others that Dongmin was talking to him to try to save Sujin, and that Team 3 will be mining a lot, taking us to round 2, with Team 3 being shown first, which I will say I don't really get why, where it does feel like it was shown out of order, if not at least something was shown out of order, as by the time we get to round 3, Team 3 ends up starting there as well, in a spot where it very much feels like a different team was meant to start each of these rounds, to where again, I feel like these are shifted around more than likely for dramatic effect, where this could have been done here to have this immediate payoff to the previous scene, though it also could have been used in the following round, in a spot where Team 2's turn there is definitely the most suspenseful of the bunch, to where, again, it could be either way, but I do feel like something here was shown out of order. But again, this being here does lead to instant payoff to Hyungmin spreading the word about Team 3 mining a lot, as we do see Team 3 end up actually not mining a lot, leading to Yeonsung losing a lot of points during this turn, but also during Team 2's turn, with Hyungmin there also trying to trick Yeonsung into bidding too high, and him end up not mining too much, to where it does lead to Yeonsung being in last after this round, effectively doing what Dongmin set out to do and protecting Sujin. Oh, we get to round 3, where again, Team 3 is first again for some reason, and we do get a lot of focus at this point on how close it is between Yoo-hyun and Hyunmin, where we see Yoo-hyun betting 15 in an attempt to beat Hyunmin. Oh well, Hyunmin's vote is obviously hidden. Wonder why. And proceed to see Dongmin telling Ah-Young to get a lot of points, only for Ah-Young to instantly pick out a bomb, and we get this fun reaction from the group that was clearly a performance. So we see Dongmin scold her for picking out a bomb, only for him to later pick a bomb himself, leading to the reveal that Hyungmin had actually bid 50 during this round, the max that he could bid, leading to the big flashback of the episode, revealing that Dongmin obviously told his team to get bombs, as he has an agreement with Hyungmin for him to do the same during his turn as well, allowing them to all get 50 points to avoid being in last, and in this case, obviously giving Hyunmin the win, leading to further flashback reveals where we see an initial combo from earlier in the episode of Ah-young trying to listen through the door and figure out who Dongmin was talking to, with the reveal now that he was talking to Hyungmin, where they agreed to work together till the end. The start of the Dongmin-Hyungmin relationship that ends up obviously being the main storyline of this season, and probably what the season's most remembered by. Really from this point on, with the exception of one specific round, they end up essentially running the show, being such a powerful duo in the game, with their skills clearly complementing each other to where they end up winning most of the upcoming main matches with very little difficulty, with this obviously revealing that they were working together this entire game to give Hyungmin the win so that he could give Dongmin the token, with us going back and seeing Dongmin giving Hyungmin advice on what to bid, and even Dongmin bidding higher numbers to avoid Hyungmin from losing points at points, to where, again, seeing the Dongmin-Hyungmin pairing really just outplay everyone else during a lot of these main matches ends up being really interesting to see in these upcoming episodes. But really the entire game here ends up coming down to the final turn of the game, coming from Team 2, which again maybe wasn't the final turn, but anyway, for Hyunmin to stick to his word to Dongmin, he essentially needs to pick out 3 bombs on his own turn, with Dongmin being really resolute in that he needs to protect Ah-young and Sujin in this spot, in a spot where that doesn't really matter that much, as, well, yeah, it would stop Ah-young and Sujin from automatically going in. I mean, they're still extremely likely to be picked for a deathmatch anyway. So for Dongmin to really strong-arm Hyungmin in this spot when, again, they're supposed to be these new allies, and even saying to him that betraying them is like betraying me, again, felt like a bit much. But again, Hyungmin does need to succeed here either way, as with Dongmin, Sujin, and Ah-young all planning to bid 50, if Hyungmin fails, the person who bid the least will end up getting all those points. And we do see them try to counter this with instead only having Sujin bid 50, but still puts Hyunmin's lead in danger here, to where it all comes down to his turn, where he ends up grabbing a handful of minerals, wanting to make sure that he has enough bombs to lose the game on the spot, leading to this really great visual of him just rushing his hand out of the mine and slamming them on the table, where we reveal that he had 4 bombs in his hand, so the plan obviously goes through, allowing Sujin, Ah-young, and Dongmin to skyrocket up the leaderboard, while Hyungmin ends up winning the match and gives the token to Dongmin, saying that he's giving it to the person he worked with all day, leading to most of the cast being shocked at this reveal, though with this Yunsung ends up being the loser, to where we do see Dongmin offering him 6 garnets to not pick Sujin or Ah-young, only for him to pick Sujin anyway, as again, that was just kind of an easy choice for most people, I feel like. But the deathmatch ends up being double-sided poker once again, which ends up being pretty boring once again. Again, Yunsung ends up playing this more optimally and playing pretty conservative, but also gets pretty fortunate with some pretty good cards, while Sujin makes a pretty critical mistake in betting on front when she actually meant to bet on back, and with that card actually being a 10, ends up costing her additional 10 chips, to where after that ends up leading to a pretty easy Yunsung win, with this finally continuing this trend of Dongmin's allies going out one by one, and throughout we have Dongmin swearing revenge to take out Yunsung, which he never really does. But again, with that we lose Sujin, who straight up was not a big loss on the season. I think Sujin, at the end of the day, probably is one of the least notable figures in Genius history. I think she's someone that is just kind of largely forgettable, where I feel like she is mostly just remembered as someone that was working with Dongmin, and even then, that wasn't that focused on the show, where she just feels like such an afterthought on this season, where, again, I don't feel like she really brings much entertainment to the show, and she never really seemed to be that good at the games themselves either. Again, she seemed to be affable socially, to where people liked her, and through that, she was kind of involved in a lot of majority groups, but it felt like she very rarely contributed to those groups, and I don't really feel like she had the most strategic mind in the game, to where it's not a shocker to me that she gets eliminated the first time she ends up going into a death match. But with that, we then move on to episode 6, where continue the Dongmin Hyungmin dominance here, and them actually being the first to enter, and while we later see them doing some trash talk after the others come in, it ends up leading to a flashback where we get the reveal that this was obviously all a ploy, where Hyungmin and Dongmin actually solidified their final 2 as they entered, and agreed to go to the finals together, which, again, they do. Now, I will say, I do think this is a bit of a risky thing to do out in the open, considering how obviously this is going to make the episodes, and again, considering the fact that Genius airs some of their episodes before the season concludes. And this could have been a bit risky. Now, I mean, to be fair, I don't believe this episode aired until towards the finale of the season, and aka too late for them to do anything about this. But again, I still feel like if I was on the Genius, I would definitely be worried of some of my late game plans being exposed here. But either way, we get to the 6th main match, that being Stormy Stock Market, where each player is given $10 to buy and sell stocks, over the course of 2 hours through entering a trading room where they're given 40 seconds before they have to leave the room, leading to timing being pretty important here as prices of these stocks end up changing every 5 minutes. But there also being 24 pieces of info being doled out about different stock price changes, with each person getting 6, 3 of them shared with each of the players next to them in the order, creating this circle of information. That was a pretty interesting aspect of this challenge. See people try to get every bit of info. It also made it a bit too easy to get all the info. And again, really at the end of the day, this ends up being a pretty simple game, but one that I do like. Again, I do like the information gathering of it and the focus on timing and planning ahead, where you have to make sure you have the right stocks at the right time. Especially considering how there's only a limited amount of those stocks, to where, again, ideally, yeah, there probably would be a bit more depth to this match, but I still find this to be a pretty fun one, especially in how it plays out. And again, I think it makes for an interesting TV product, even though I do think if it were to be played again in the same format, it probably would not work as well. But here we do see Dongmin and Hyungmin being actually next to each other in the order, which actually works against them, as obviously that means that they have less information to share within each other, which, I mean, to be fair, also makes their later accomplishment that much more impressive, though we do get some funny moments from these initial sequences, with Hyungmin mocking Dongmin's handwriting, which again ends up being a reoccurring joke on this episode, all while Ah-young ends up having a cold and proceeds to cough in this really over-the-top way that leads to the dealer even breaking character. Anyway, we see them having 30 minutes to prepare before the game begins, to where, again, most people end up sharing their info, to where most of them have almost all the info by the time the game starts, though we do end up seeing Dongmin and Hyungmin obviously sharing the info that they gathered individually, leading to them seeming to be the only ones that have the full board. But again, I did like, again, this more innovative strategy from them and then trying to hide notes around the set to further hide them working together, where again we see Hyungmin finally having a tough time reading Dongmin's note because of his bad handwriting. But all while this is happening, we see Junghoon for some reason decide to not bother getting more information, where all of his initial info ends up focusing around the disconnect stocks, where he just decides to go all in on disconnect, which is really stupid, as while yes, he knows when the stock will go up, he doesn't know what will happen outside of those times, as obviously the stock isn't just going to go up all the time. That would make for a really boring game. But again, that seems to be this oversight that Junghoon makes here, putting him in the back foot in a spot where, again, this just felt like complete idiocy. But either way, we get to round 1, where Hyungmin and Dongmin both end up putting out the clock when they get into the trading rooms, with Dongmin pretending to be upset as he comes out, saying how come time is so short, really just messing with the other players. But again, because everyone pretty much has the same info, it leads to them buying out all the best stocks, all while certain other players end up struggling here with them having the info, as again most people do, though they're simply not buying any stocks to buy as they didn't get to them quick enough. But unsurprisingly, Hyungmin ends up being in the lead after the first hour, to where Yo-hyun creates a plan to try to take down Hyungmin, to not tell Hyungmin information or even just outright lying to him about info, and being annoyed at the fact that he's second to Hyungmin once again, which ends up pretty much being the story of this season. Though again, finally, Dongmin is also beating him in this instance, which he doesn't realize, and he ends up telling Dongmin about this plan, to where again, it really just shows you how much people are buying into Dongmin and Hyungmin not working together, and really all this ends up leading to nothing, to where Dongmin and Hyungmin still end up getting all the info, despite Yo-hyun's attempts. When the lead up to round 2, we see Hyungmin realizing that there's no info about 240, to which right before the game starts, we get the reveal that there can be a final bit of information that can be bought in an auction alongside a black garnet, where you do see Hyunmin and Yeonju in a bidding war here, them pooling garnets with other players, where I do find it funny how Hyungmin ends up obviously getting garnets from Dongmin in a spot where Dongmin just makes it very openly clear that he wants it to just be him and Hyungmin that get this information, so that they could obviously share it between the two. But again, what happened to you pretending you weren't working together? But anyway, round 2 starts, and we do get some humor from Ah-young going in over and over again and can't really do anything because all the shares that she wants to buy are already gone. Oh, we see Hyungmin really cutting it close a couple of times, only for us to see him like cut deals to skip people in line, which again, why are they just letting him do that? I mean, yeah, he promises to give them bits of his speaker info, which he does, technically. But it does seem ridiculous that they end up furthering empowering the person in first. But again, this allows him to really make the most of this format, again, selling his stocks at the last second while then buying stocks immediately after new prices are in place. But again, as 240 ends up coming up, we do see Hyungmin selling all of his stocks, and proceeds to pretend to get excited to go back in line, only for him to leave, all while we see Dongmin literally doing the same, where we get the reveal that 240 is a stock market crash, with Dongmin and Hyungmin obviously playing accordingly, using those previously cut deals to get other players to sell their stocks, allowing Dongmin to snatch all of them up for their new low prices, with Hyungmin at this point essentially giving up his game to give Dongmin the win, even selling his own stocks to have Dongmin buy them for low prices, where Dongmin does get a pretty easy win by the end of it, with him obviously giving Hyungmin the token once again, giving him their second win in a row, though obviously alerting other people to the fact that they are clearly a power duo at this point, which might play a factor in the following episode. But here we do see Junghoon end up in last, with people being shocked at this, with it being assumed that it was going to be Ah Young, but again, he literally didn't do anything in this game outside buy disconnects, which he eventually knew he was screwed with. So again, it shouldn't have been that big of a surprise, but his choice here ends up being between Yeonju and Jungbom due to him having previous deals with the other eligible players, where in this moment we do see the other players give Hyungmin their Garnets to protect them, only for Yeonju to refuse doing so, probably being the best move she makes all season, as this leads to Junghoon picking Jungbom instead, with the deathmatch here being the return of betting rock, paper, scissors, again same rules as last time, but with the addition of virtual players being added in as known picks. But really, everyone seems to tell both their info. But we see the game play out in a somewhat interesting way here, where Jungbom initially loses the first round to have Junghoon lose a point, only for Junghoon to proceed to do the exact same thing, meaning that they both have 0 chips by the time of round 3, and proceed to also do the exact same thing in the following rounds, with them both betting on lose, only for their opponent to win, having us tied again towards the end of the match, to where it seems to be pretty even until it isn't, where we do see Junghoon bet a bit too conservative at a point, setting him a bit behind. Jungbom getting more points for winning than Junghoon got for betting. Then Jungbom successfully bets on lose towards the end of it, pulling him way ahead, giving him the win there, meaning that we do obviously lose Junghoon in this episode, which, that's fine. Where I feel like Junghoon's an interesting player in the sense that I always remembered him as being underrated. I felt like I came into this rewatch thinking Junghoon was actually a pretty good player that kind of got unlucky. When rewatching this, though, I kind of realized it's not really the case. I think Junghoon just kind of sucks at the game. While there are moments of him actually like seeming to know what he's doing, I do feel like I very much overstated his game ability, where he is kind of just a doofus for a lot of this season and plays the game pretty terribly at points and really doesn't even have really that good of a moment ever on this season. I think my opinion of Junghoon's game definitely went down on the rewatch, and just in general, Junghoon has always been a mostly dull character to me. To be fair, from an entertainment standpoint, I actually probably liked him more on the rewatch, where again, I felt like there were a lot more dodo moments from him that could be perceived as funny, though even those weren't particularly common on the show. But again, there's still moments here and there. I do think, again, at the end of the day, he's still pretty dull, but I think there's more reason to like him as a character on the rewatch, but also more reason to think of him as a pretty bad player on the rewatch. So I do feel like I have pretty mixed opinions on him in the grand scheme of things. But with that, we move on to episode 7, a pretty unique episode in the show's history, probably being the best episode of the season and one of the best in the entire series. But it all starts with Yohyun, Yeonsung, and Jungbom being the first to enter, with them instantly talking about how Dongmin and Hyungmin are working together and that they need to break them up, which ends up really being the crux of this episode, with this episode seeing the entire house flipping on Dongmin and Hyungmin, which, while it doesn't last particularly long, at least the events of this episode being pretty entertaining. Sure, again, while in the grand scheme of things ends up being a minor blip on the season, and also just a minor blip on Dongmin and Hyungmin's runs on the season, with them recovering immediately afterwards, it still was nice to see them face some genuine adversity in this spot. But anyway, we get to the 7th main match, and that being Constellation Game. A game where you have to gather colored stars and use them to complete constellations, with each constellation needing a different number of stars, and each divvy out a different point amount. To which the way that players are given these stars, that we see players being given 5 cards with different number amounts on them, to where each player has to submit a card face down, to where those that submit the same number don't get any cards, while the others will divvy up the 7 stars that are drawn each round alongside the 1 bomb, getting the amount of the card that they had picked, to where the game ends if one player gets 3 bombs, to where that person will immediately go into the death match, though the game can also end through someone completing 3 constellations, where at that point the determining factor will be the lowest point totals, to where really this is a match here that does make for good TV, but kind of on accident, where I do think this is actually a game that is inherently broken, where there's an extremely easy way to just dominate this game. Again, you can form a 5-person majority and have each of the players use one of each card, and through that completely ice out the 2 other players, where, again, it just feels like such a basic strategy to where I even remember when I first watched this game, even I thought of this strategy right away. Sure, they will always match with another player, never get any points, which, again, in most situations, this would be bad TV. Again, this would be the majority being able to gang up on the minority, which is typically bad, but I do think it makes for good TV here, specifically due to the context, and I think because that they become very fortunate in this challenge being played out in the best possible way, even though I do think the game design of this main match is just fundamentally flawed. Anyway, right away, we do see Hyungmin obviously piece together the optimal strat here, and we see him pulling in Ah-young and Jungbom, all while Dongmin ends up pulling in Yeonju to make this plan a reality, and through that they could easily just target Yohyun and Yeonsang, with Hyungmin acting really cocky throughout the beginning portions of this episode, leading to a flash forward showing Hyungmin crying 2 hours later, which ends up being a bit more of a genuine flashback here. Now, not really in terms of the actual context of the scene that was shown, as, again, that is a completely different context than the reality, but it still gives off the same message of something that actually happens, as, again, by seeing Hyungmin crying, I think it's implied that Hyungmin ends up losing, ends up being on the bottom, which, I mean, to fair, he does lose the main match. Again, not necessarily a death match. To where, again, it feels like this is a more genuine flash forward here. Well, again, that would typically be a critique. I do feel like it actually ends up playing pretty well in this spot. Again, setting up this mystery of what could go wrong for Hyungmin, and still, in a way, still technically misleading in the sense that, again, we don't see the scene of Hyungmin crying until the tail end of the episode, and it's not because he actually loses, to where I do think if you remembered this scene after the main match and realized that he hadn't cried yet, I think you would be assuming that he probably loses the death match because of this flash forward, to where, again, I guess it does still technically mislead you in a way. But obviously, following this, we do see Hyungmin proceed to detail his entire strategy, the Jungbom, along with also the concept of using your black garnets on the person picked for the death match to make sure it's the 2 people on the outside of the alliance going to the death match, while also having to make sure that the bottom 2 don't have 3 black garnets together to not give them the chance of saving themselves in that spot, to where, again, it's a very intricate plan here. Dare I say, a foolproof plan. The issue is that Hyungmin is doing this in a spot where he doesn't seem to realize that they could literally just do the same thing to him, as him and Dongmin only have 2 black garnets, to where, again, this obviously completely backfires on him, to where we do get to round 1, where Dongmin and Hyungmin both end up tying right away and are excluded, though again seem to not think much of it initially until we get to round 2, where the exact same thing happens again, which I really love how this scene is edited here, where we get this really over-the-top portrayal as Dongmin and Hyungmin realize that something is wrong, and the music builds up as Hyungmin is like snapping his fingers and goes off on his own. We see Jungbom whisper that he thinks Hyungmin noticed, with us getting the big reveal now that Jungbom had told Yeonsang about the strategy that Hyungmin created, and that Yeonsang realized that they could just do the exact same thing back to them. Where Jungbom gathers the other players, adding Ah-young and Yeonju to this plan in a spot where they are initially worried about going through this, as they think they'll be targeted by Hyungmin and Dongmin, though end up going along with it under the promise that they'll be given immunity. So again, we see the entire structure of this house completely flip in an instance, in a spot where Dongmin and Hyungmin had been really running a show for the last 2 rounds, really outplaying everybody, and see them face their comeuppance here was interesting to see, to where, again, it doesn't last, but again, I think you rarely see this in the Genius of the outsiders kind of getting together to take out the people on top. Which I guess you can like debate this happened with like Jinho and Poong during the open pass game, but again, even then, I don't feel like that was really a direct comparison. To where, I mean, this really ends up feeling more so like the power shifts that you'd see in Big Brother, which, to be fair, I mean, that's mainly allowed because of how broken the game is to begin with. But again, I think it was a unique thing to see on the Genius. So again, it's part of why this ends up being the best episode of the season. But following this, we do see Hyungmin and Dongmin, again, never give up, despite being pretty dead in the water here, where we see them come up with numerous plans they try to enact, only for all of them to lead to nothing, where we do see Dongmin tell Hyungmin to try and make a fake deal with Jungbom, pretending to give him the token if they end up winning, which again, Jungbom doesn't really bite there, while we also see them try to do this good cop, bad cop routine with Ah-young and Yeonju to try to taunt them into working with them again, only for that to lead to nothing. So again, it felt like there was not really that much they could really do here, though I guess I should mention the fact that there actually was a trick in this game. So again, no one ends up figuring this out, but it is something that could have helped Dongmin and Youngmin in that the backs of each of the cards actually have a different number of stars in the center in conjunction with the card number, which again could have been very helpful in gauging who used what card. To which, again, theoretically, they could have stopped the other team's attempts to give Yeonju and Ah-young the win and then proceed to court them back, with them now being vulnerable, though realistically, I don't think this would work, with the effectiveness of this really coming down to the order, as to make this useful, Dongmin and Youngmin would have to be at the back of the pack to actually be able to take points away from Yeonju and Ah-young, and even then, even if it was effective, I don't know if they could have actually gotten Ah-young and Yeonju to flip on their alliance this late into the game in particular, where, well, yeah, they technically had this trick in the game that could have benefited them here. I don't know how much use they really would have gotten out of it, but really the rest of the game here ends up playing out as expected, with the majority intentionally splitting up the bombs between them, while Yeonju ends up racking up the points to give her the win. Oh, again, we get some pretty strong content here from Dongmin and him trying to taunt them along the way, with Dongmin saying, "Let's all die today." And we get this funny moment of him yelling, "I'll never die," just as Ah-young puts her card in to scare her. We also have him like walking around them like a shark, to where we get like the Jaws music playing as he like paces around the room and mocks their plan. They use black garnets to plan a black mission, which I always found it funny the way he says black mission here, in this over-the-top way, though. This, we do see Dongmin and Youngmin now transition to talking about who to pick for the deathmatch, as, again, the person who they pick will obviously more than likely be playing in a black mission, interestingly to some strategy of them thinking ahead and trying to pick someone that will pick the memory task, as that would leave the math task open for Youngmin to potentially use later in the game, and showing them think ahead again, though for some reason they don't seem to actually realize the fact that the women have this deal for immunity from the other side, with them planning on picking Ah-young in this spot. And even beyond that, I mean, this also leads to them eventually talking about how they now hope to try to make her the actual loser and get her to vote in one of her own allies instead of them, which again felt like a lot of delusion here. And I'm thinking that this could even go through, as really from any point of view, I don't even think there's even a way for them to not come in last at this point. As to do so, they would need to essentially get the winner of the game to turn against Ah-young, or convince someone to give Ah-young all the bombs, which again felt like that was never going to happen here. Or again, we do get this final attempt from them to try to flip Yoo-hyun and try to get him to help them give Ah-young bombs, though again, Yoo-hyun doesn't take the bait here, and really, I mean, even then, even if he wanted to, it would have been too late to do so, considering the card she was playing anyway. But anyway, Yeonju ends up winning here, leading to a pretty fun moment from her here, and talking about how this wasn't a beautiful win, but it was an ugly victory, and her proceeding to say that this is the ugly victor the genius talks about, and this time it's me, which I mean, in reality, it's kind of a nothing scene, though it's one that I always remember from Yeonju here. Here we do see Hyungmin, Dongmin, and Yeonsung and then being joint last, where obviously Yeonju gets to pick who to go to elimination. Well, it's getting a flashback to the Alliance agreeing on sending in Hyungmin, as he's the scariest in main matches. Oh, well, Yeonju has a better relationship with Dongmin anyway. Oh, well, we see Yeonju end up giving immunity to Ah-young, and going along with the majority's plan, which again was both to secure Yeonju and Ah-young's loyalty, but also to make sure the strongest competitors were there to go into the black mission. But finally we get to Youngmin's pick, where he ends up picking Jangbom as the person that he feels the most betrayed by, which is pretty apt, though at the same time, I do find it very strange, the dynamic between Jangbom and Hyungmin, the fact that they were very clearly very close. And it's referred to at many points in this season, but I feel like we very rarely ever see it being emphasized on the show. But anyway, obviously Jangbom announces that he's going to be playing in the Black Mission, picking the memory game, which is again what Dongmin and Hyungmin wanted, which the memory game is to memorize 12 bus stops in conjunction to a number, where they'll be shown them for 30 seconds, only for them to proceed to be shuffled around and you having to name them just off their number. During which we see Jangbom having his mouth open, seemingly shocked by the difficulty of this mission, only for him to say in confessional that he was confident, which is like, again, he didn't look like it. But again, this is a brutally difficult mission here, to where I don't know if many people would have been able to do this, starting again the very limited amount of time that you have to memorize these names. Oh, well, also the dealer seemingly took her time in laying out these cards as well, though I feel like most people would have probably forgotten about it by the time the cards end up being fully laid out. But though we do see Jangbom utilize a pretty effective memorization tactic and memorizing the beginning of all the words and separating into 3 phrases, where, again, it actually seemed like he could have had a shot here. So he proceeds to mess up on the 4th question, leading to him failing the mission anyway, because that's just how black missions play out, with, again, this actually being the last black mission played on this game, which is, again, such a pathetic whimper for this twist here in a spot where it once again fails. And again, this one felt like it was really setting themselves up for disaster. So I do think this is a challenge that most people probably would have struggled with. Or again, in comparison to the Go Hap mission from earlier, I feel like that one was infinitely easier than this one here. But either way, we get to the death match, which is obviously Hyungmin versus Jongbom, which ends up being revealed to be a new game called 12 Jongi, a chess-like game where you have 4 pieces that you move around on a 12-square board, which the goal of the game is to obviously protect your king using other pieces, all of which can move in different ways, though you can obviously capture your opponent's pieces along the way and proceed to use them as your own, which I do like that added level of complexity to the game, but really the way that you win this is obviously by, again, capturing the king or by having your king survive in your enemy's territory for a round. Obviously being a game about strategy and trying to plot ahead, engage what your opponent's going to do, which in general I think is a great game for the Genius. Again, feeling like the Genius's answer to chess, and definitely being better than laser chess, which was kind of a broken game there. Though, I'll be honest, it's a game that does kind of go over my head, where, again, I've never personally been that good at chess-like games, to where I feel like I would personally suck at a game like this, and even in general, I don't find it the easiest to follow from the TV show point of things, though it is a game that really embodies what the show is about, really requiring a lot of the skills that are necessary for you to do well in the Genius. That specifically fits into Hyungmin's skill set, being a game that only he ends up winning over the course of this season. He does seem to be pretty unbeatable at this specific match coming out of this season. Anyway, the game does start where we do see both kind of just meandering around at the beginning, though Hyungmin being pretty effective playing mind games here and making moves that leave Jongbom confused, all while even saying check at a point where, despite Jongbom having made a mistake, it still left him with a decent amount of options at that point, though it does leave Jongbom feeling defeated, to where he ends up retreating his king, allowing Hyungmin to take over all of his pieces, and he ends up making another critical mistake in placing one of his pieces to defend one side, all forgetting that in doing so, Hyungmin can then move his king into Jongbom's territory, giving him the win here, in a spot where Hyungmin is very emotional after winning, being upset at having to eliminate Jongbom, which is, again, the scene from the flash forward, which, and obviously the context of all this is radically different. Again, Hyungmin's obviously not crying over his elimination, he's crying over Jongbom's elimination, which, while, again, earlier it was used to imply Hyungmin taking a fall, it still is technically misleading, and him actually crying in this spot because he had won over someone that he was super close to. But either way, with that, we lose Jongbom, who I do like on this season. Like, I do feel like he's a very affable player, one that seems very strictly minded, and again, seems to take things on the chin, to where, again, he never seems to take things personally. He seems to always be aware that this is a game, and again, something I've always respected from Jongbom here. And with that, again, I do think he's actually probably one of the better Genius players in the grand scheme of the show. I think he's someone that, while, again, middling results on this season, I do think he clearly does have an understanding of the game, and again, had some deathmatch ability, and again, pulled off this entire coup on Hyungmin, to where I think there's clearly some game ability there. I do think in the grand scheme of things, though, he ends up having a pretty mixed run on this season, and when transitioning this to him as a character, I will say, I do think Jongbom's kind of boring, which, again, kind of is the epitome of this season. Again, as I said, I do think the cast of this season is probably one of the best in history of the show from a gameplay perspective, but is also probably the worst from an entertainment standpoint. I think Jongbom, again, perfectly encapsulates that. Again, something, again, I think is pretty good at the game, but is also not particularly interesting while doing so. So while I do think he's a player that would have been interesting to see in Grand Final, particularly due to the caliber of player that he is, I do think it also makes sense that he didn't make the cut there, considering how lackluster of a TV presence he ends up being. And over episode 8, an episode that is just kind of a strange one that feels, again, very opposed to the previous one, and it feeling like it undoes a lot of what that episode did. Also continuing the trend of the Black Garnet twist, making the main match feel a bit superfluous, but either way, the episode does start with Ayoung and Dongmin being the first to enter, where we instantly get a lot of bickering between the two. It starts off with her being annoyed at how he didn't lead her in, leading to him pretending to push her down the stairs, but this does lead to him asking her if she wants to work with him, to which she instantly accepts, which is just showing Dongmin and Hyunmin back on top already, with them obviously later getting Yeonju to flip as well. But either way, we get to the 8th main match of the season, that being Investment and Donation, a game where each player is given $150 to utilize over 9 rounds, where they have to split the money between investing and donating. Each round, where donating the least gives you a miser label, all while investing the most gives you a shareholder label. For the person that invests the most being immune from getting a miser label. Toward the end of each round, we do see the amount spent by each individual not being revealed, but the total amount that everyone utilized is, along with who gets a label for each round, to where, in essence, this essentially ends up being a really big game of Black and White 2, where, again, you only have a certain amount of money to utilize for the whole game, and you aren't given the full info on how much everyone else used, to where you obviously utilize the info that you get to deduce how much you should bid, to where, again, it just feels like a main match version of Black and White, which I do like on paper. As, again, I've always liked Black and White, and I feel like an expanded version of that is cool to see here, though at the same time, this is, again, a point where the match itself becomes such an afterthought in this episode, and I feel like the way that it plays out here doesn't live up to its concept, with it turning into people essentially just trying to lose the game on purpose, where, again, we're at the point where Black Garnets at this point in the game really incentivizes alliances to have somebody lose for their team, only for them to go into a black mission, which would allow both deathmatch candidates to be members of the opposing team. To where, I mean, that does lead to kind of a humorous aspect of this episode, and the fact that, again, we're seeing people fight to lose this game, but I do think it strips away what was actually kind of interesting from this game's initial premise. But again, the game does start here with Dongmin instantly getting his group together and telling them that he came here to die today, saying he couldn't sleep all week and that he's willing to put his life on the line today. Again, seemingly in reaction to what happened the previous week with him feeling like he should have been the one to go into the death match, which don't know really why. I mean, this purely feels like an ego thing of him feeling like the shot should have been taken at him instead of Hyungmin, and really, again, this is just such an inoptimal move for his game. And again, this doesn't really serve his game really anything strategically outside of, I guess, it keeps Ah-young and Yeonju in line, which, again, would have been good if this was all a ploy the entire time, but again, it wasn't. As, again, I do think he genuinely wanted to throw himself in. And even then, he doesn't even play this particularly well either, where he instantly tells both Ah-young and Yeonju that they're going to give Hyunmin the win, or he's going to give one of them the token, which it's like, that's not the way to maintain their loyalty. Or again, the optimal way to maintain their loyalty is to promise both of them immunity. Yeah, this is a spot where, again, he's promising only one of them and not even telling them which one it is going to be. So again, I felt like that was suboptimal play, even though it doesn't come back to bite him. But again, it's also really funny how Dongmin does leave this saying that he's gonna guarantee that they survive, which obviously happens, to where we obviously get a flash forward to show Dongmin trying to make a deal with Yoo-hyun, saying he'll make him safe in exchange for 10 garnets, which again implies him going against his team, which is, again, misleading. Now he's actually doing pretty much the opposite in this moment. This does end up leading to another pretty ridiculous moment from Dongmin here, where, again, he goes to the women and tells them that he wants them to give him half of their garnets as a security deposit, saying that if they do so, then that's when he'll tell them his strategy, which, again, we see Ah-young instantly agreeing to this, though we do see Yeonju be a bit more reluctant, as you should be, as, again, this is a ridiculous ask here, and I generally don't even understand why they continue to work with Dongmin at this point. But again, this does lead to Yeonju deciding to talk to the other side, talking to Yoo-hyun, leading to her spilling to him that the reason why she's working with Dongmin is as he wants to go in and use his black garnets, which ends up being a really humorous scene here as we immediately falling to see Dongmin pull her away and tell her that you can't tell him that I want to come in last, leading to her making this really funny face as if she'd seen a ghost, really feeling like a scene right out of a sitcom. But this obviously alerts Yoo-hyun to what the other side is doing and leads to his attempts at doing the same, which again leads to the humor of both sides wanting to lose here. But again, the game does start with things going according to plan here for the Hyungmin-Dongmin alliance, with them having one member per round make a big investment to get the shareholder label, all while Dongmin ends up donating 0, so he gets the miser label, where eventually, as usual, becomes very clear that Hyungmin's going to end up winning this game, especially after he barely bids over Hyungmin in round 3, and then outright winning round 4, where he has a pretty big lead at that point. But along the way, we do get some shifts to Dongmin's miser strategy, where in round 2, we instantly see him talk about now wanting to actually give Yoo-hyun and Yeonsung miser labels, which I straight up don't understand why, as again, if his plan is to throw himself into a deathmatch, as what it seemed to be, this is just opening up the possibility of you not going into the deathmatch. Try to get the notion that he wants them to waste their money, and I guess like by having them have more miser labels, they'll be more willing to utilize their money. But again, all this felt like him playing it a bit too cute. And we once again have him, again, kind of mishandling Yeonju once again in round 5 and telling her that she needs to get a miser label for some reason, which she's annoyed by. Oh, we see them creating this massive ploy for her to convince Yohyun that Dongmin had taken all of her garnets and that she's willing to flip and be a spy for them. A plan that Yohyun just sees through right away, leading to the full reveal that he's actually trying to get miser labels at this point, trying to lose here to avoid Dongmin playing in the black mission. Weirdly being Yohyun seeming to be willing to go to the deathmatch outright to avoid having to go in against Yunsung, I guess. Or I guess just to spite Dongmin, as really in any of these situations, he's going into elimination anyway. But again, it is really funny to see Dongmin say that he came here to die today, but he lives anyway. To where at this point, Dongmin can't come in last, even if he wanted to, as Yohyun already has the lead in miser labels, making it funny that Yohyun outplays Dongmin in this instance of trying to throw himself into the death match. And again, as I said, like at this point, the main strategy of main match becomes a complete afterthought here, with the result pretty much being decided from the very beginning. And at this point, it's just a fight for who loses, where it does lead up to an interesting Yohyun Dongmin talk, with Dongmin trying to make a deal with him and telling him that no one's a certain win in a death match. Again, funny coming from Dongmin, who constantly talks about how he's going to win a death match if he ever gets thrown in. But again, we do get the scene from the flash forward where we see Dongmin trying to make a deal to give Yohyun immunity in exchange for Yohyun letting Dongmin lose, saying that he'll pick Yunsung for the death match instead, only for Yohyun to not bite there. And we later see him also offer a black garnet to Yohyun in exchange for 10 garnets, as we saw in the flash forward, though that doesn't go through either, which is never really explained why. Though again, I assume it's because he was unwilling to throw Yunsung under the bus. But anyway, in this moment, we also see Hyungmin and Ah-young talking, with Ah-young asking if Hyungmin would be willing to give her black garnets to play into black mission, with him initially agreeing, only to say he has to confirm with Dongmin first, to which Dongmin proceeds to say no, as it would be a waste for them, as they wouldn't stand a chance in the black mission, with Dongmin saying that that's why he wanted to go, because he's an egomaniac, with him also saying here that their black garnets are their last resort for getting to the final, which makes no sense considering they literally were planning on wasting their black garnets in this round. So I don't get why now it's important that they keep their black garnets for the next round. And again, to be fair, it is the correct call. I mean, again, they should be strategically saving the black garnets there in the case they need it for the upcoming round. Though again, it makes no sense with his overall rationale of how he's playing this round. But anyway, Yohyun is the elimination candidate, all while Hyungmin wins and proceeds to then give his token to Dongmin, which again, funny how Dongmin talks throughout the entire episode about how he wants to get thrown into elimination, and even in this moment calls it a complete defeat, when we're in a spot where he and his closest ally both have immunity here. But anyway, Yohyun ends up picking Ah-young, as she was the one to flip against him first, while Yeonju was more hesitant, I guess, taking us to the death match, which is Memory Maze, a game that has them having to navigate through a maze with 32 invisible walls, all within a 7x7 board, so you can move 3 squares at a time and have to find your way to your goal on the other side of the board, where if you fail, you have to go back to the start. And along with that, you also get 2 double chances, which allow you to move 6 squares in one turn instead of 3, which I will say, I wish this was actually a thing that happened more often in this game, as really, at the end of the day, I think this is a really boring deathmatch. Where again, it's just boring to see people have to start from the beginning again, and we get this montage constantly of seeing people just have to go through the spots that they've already previously been through, where again, it's just a monotonous challenge. Now again, as a genius game, it's fine. Again, it tests your memory, which is a skill you would think you would need to be a genius, though in many ways it kind of reminds me of something like Same Picture Hunt, in that again, like, it's a fine death match, but it's also one that again is not particularly interesting, essentially just testing like one specific skill, and that skill being one that isn't that interesting to see be tested. Or again, it's just a very simplistic game. Again, doesn't lead to good TV either, as here we essentially just see Ah-young completely forgetting where she had previously been almost every turn, where Yohyun, despite failing twice at the very end, he's still able to win the match here, with Ah-young finally leaving very bitter at Dongmin, saying that she hopes that she's his last victim and that she wants him to not get any of her garnets, despite the fact that Hyungmin proceeds to give him some of her garnets in the following episode. But anyway, we do lose Ah Young here, who is an incredible character on this season. Again, I think Ah Young is definitely one of the main highlights of this season, to where straight up, I don't feel like I really talked about Ah Young as much as I probably could have in this retrospective, as I do think something that Ah Young really excels at is that she's so good at like having these like fun little character moments, and not really these like big moments that I felt like were necessary to go out of my way to talk about in this retrospective. But again, there's just like a lot of smaller quirks about her character, with her just coming off as this massive like dodo presence throughout a lot of this season, though one that is probably still one of the best characters the Genius has ever seen, to where I'm still pretty surprised at the fact that she was not picked for grand final, especially over someone like a Jungmoon in particular, to where for me, I feel like Ah Young is definitely one of the biggest casting misses from that season, to where like I guess I can kind of get it in the sense that Ah Young is someone that, again, doesn't really have that much potential from a gameplay perspective. While there are, again, points that she does somewhat well, I do think she spends a lot of this game kind of aloof at what's really going on and kind of just being led around by some of the stronger players, to where, again, I don't think there really is much potential for Ah Young as a player, though I think she's someone that I definitely would have wanted to see play again, just considering how much she brings to the television product. But anyway, with that, we then move on to episode 9, an episode that, coming into this rewatch, always remembered as one of the worst of the season, and I still don't particularly love it. While there are some fun character moments here and there from it, I do think it's an episode that as a whole has a pretty boring main match and also a pretty boring death match, to where again, I think it's just an episode that entirely comes off as pretty mundane. But either way, we do start off with the reveal that it is the Loved Ones episode, with each player bringing a guest that will play the game with them, with most of the guests here being pretty boring, with Yeonju, Hyungmin, and Yeonsong all bringing KAIST graduates, to where outside of Yeonju's being a member of the Peppertones, which leads to a lot of references to that band, and a funny little moment that comes along with Dongmin bringing in an idol who proceeds to pretend to know who the Peppertones are until it quickly gets found out that he's lying. Like, outside that, again, they really didn't bring much to the table, to where the only guest that is pretty notable here ends up being Yohyun's, with his guest being his acquaintance's wife, that being Ga-young, the wife of Yohwan from Season 2, which is a cool cameo here, as again, she was someone that was referred to quite a bit in that season, someone that was seemingly making a lot of calls to the other players and trying to set up deals for Yohwan, to where mixing that with the fact that she's also a pretty big celebrity in herself. I think it's cool to see her on this season, but it's also extremely random. Like, why was she the loved one for Yohyun when she has almost no real connection to him? To where, again, she is listed as his acquaintance's wife, to where I believe the story is that him and Yohwan knew of each other through their poker connection, and it was said that Yohwan was busy, and that's why Ga-young is here. But 100%, this very much felt like a situation of production kind of forcing him to bring her into the game, as obviously she was kind of a big get for the show. Though, I actually do think this actually ends up screwing Yoo-hyun over here, and him being given some pretty bad advice from her across this round. But Ga-young does have a pretty fun entrance here, with her instantly being very over the top and trying to jump over the railing, and then her failing to slide down the railing, only for us to then get some banter between her and Dongmin, with them clearly having a rapport from before the show, with him constantly making jokes about how old she is. But anyway, it is also here where we get the reveal that this is the last day for Black Missions, to which we get Hyungmin asking what happens to Black Garnets after this, and Dongmin saying that they turn to crap, leading to the dealer laughing, which is like, really? Like that's really what we break character for? But again, I do find it weird that the Black Missions end at the final 5 round here, in a spot where the token of immortality was available to be used until the final 4, where again, considering these function similarly, you would think that they would keep it the same, though I guess they probably weren't particularly happy in how last time played out, where essentially whoever had the token of immortality, where essentially 2 people were just automatically going into deathmatch because of how the token of immortality played out, to where I guess they were trying to avoid that with this season. But this is a spot where that probably does end up changing the actual results of the following round. But anyway, we get to the 9th main match, which is sadly Middle Race 2. The return of Middle Race, which again is probably the most convoluted game the Genius has ever done, and what do you know, we get to see it again, though to be fair, a more streamlined version of it, to where while it's still convoluted, we do get some pretty sizable changes to the game here. The biggest of which being that the winners and losers are determined in a different way than last time, where it does very much feel like the producers did learn their lesson from how the game played out last last time and made a lot of adjustments accordingly, where here, instead of having first and last automatically go into the death match, they changed that rule to where those that finish 5th and 6th, aka the middle, are the winners of the game, and through that have to proceed to pick who goes into the death match out of the other non-immune players, which is for the better all around. One, it makes the game shorter, which was a major complaint of the game the first time around, and how long it took, as you don't need to play out the full game at this point. You essentially only need to play out until the 6th place person finishes. But also, I'd also like this from a game design standpoint as well, where through only 5th and 6th mattering here, it gives less incentive for a big group to work together to force 2 people into first and last like last time, as in this position you could still be picked for a death match no matter where you place outside of the middle, to where, again, I think if this was the format for how the game played out in its first iteration, I do think that game probably plays out very differently, though I mean, something that does affect this iteration of the game is the fact that obviously everyone is inherently playing as a duo, where that does kind of nullify the importance of this format change, where again, this version of the game does incentivize playing in pairs and trying to give both members of that pair immunity, to where, considering the fact that this game only has 5 real players in it, and each having a partner, essentially leads to these pretty sizable groups forming anyway, where essentially through this game we have a 6v4 battle between alliances here. But obviously the guests will be playing in this game as well, to where if they win, they will give their tokens to their partners, though an interesting aspect of that is that because of that, essentially each player will get 2 rolls, and in essence 2 chances to get a good roll, and considering the fact that essentially it is guaranteed that the genius players will get one of the first 5 picks, it does make it very unlikely that you'll completely be iced out in this game in the way that like Yunsok or Yunsung were last time around, by having these like really bad rolls that screwed them over, to where, or again, just in general, this felt like a more balanced version of Middle Race here, to where, while again, certain skills are definitely better than others, I don't think the disparity was nearly as large as it was last time. But again, with that, we also get some change up in the roles here, where we do get a few new roles. We also get some of the lesser roles from last time being taken away, like Quick, One, and thankfully Jump, which again is essentially a role that gives you an auto lose, to where, again, I thought those are all pretty welcome changes to the game here. Before we get to the actual picking of the roles, we actually do get some strategy beforehand from Dongmin and Hyungmin, shockingly wanting to work together again, with Yoo-hyun calling them out for doing so, only for Gae-hyung to advise Yoo-hyun to work with them this time instead, saying that no one would expect it, because I guess that's something that matters here. To which we do see Yoo-hyun instantly reject this, saying that's better to split them up, but we do instead later see him go through this plan. Really the first time this entire game that he ends up working with Dongmin and Hyungmin, and finally one of the few times that they don't end up dominating a game, but then finally taking the fall for them in this spot, where outright I do think this is just a bad move for Yoo-hyun to be going through with. So we're obviously in the world where everything fails here. Again, he's such an easy person to be thrown into the deathmatch. Him being someone that betrayed the other side of the house, while also being someone that isn't really that trusted by the Dongmin Hyungmin side, to where, and he's clearly the third in that bandwagon, but to where, again, he's the easiest person to throw under the bus. Well, again, even if this plan went through, again, it's still a spot where at most only 2 people are going to be given immunity. To where, again, he's almost definitely getting picked for the deathmatch from Yunsong or Yeonju in this spot, to where either way he's on the bottom by taking this route, which again I just think is such a bad move from his point of view, again seemingly spurred on by Ga-hyung's advice, which again is terrible advice. And even despite that, him flipping here really just feels like a complete half measure, to where again he burns Yunsong by not working with him here, but also proceeds to tell Dongmin that he's not willing to throw Yunsong into the death match and would pick Youngsung over Hyungmin if it comes down to it, to where at that point, it's like, why aren't you just working with Youngsung then? Again, in the world where he's working with Youngsung, they're the top 2. Again, Youngsung would have no incentive to turn against Yoo-hyun in that spot. But essentially, at that point, Yeonju would be in the spot that Yoo-hyun really ends up being in. And really, he also probably more than likely just wins this match if he works alongside Youngsung. But again, he gives up that spot for what is essentially a near guarantee that he goes into the death match. But through this new majority forming here, we do obviously see Yunsung and Yeonju work together, seemingly as an alliance of convenience here, though obviously they end up being a pretty effective pair in this game. though also a pair that gets pretty lucky in the fact that we do get the random draw for the draft order, with Yunsong and Yeonju getting picks 1 and 3 respectively, being a massive advantage there, obviously allowing them to get some of the better rolls off the bat, while the majority ends up getting the later picks on the board, really upending their initial plans, with both sides having similar ideas of what roles to go for here. This does lead to Yohyun once again be conflicted here in if he should flip back to Youngsung and Yeonju, as if he does, that means that alliance has picks 1, 2, and 3 to where they could easily overpower Dongmin and Hyungmin. But we once again see Gaehyung talk him out of it, to where that in essence ends up pretty much stealing his fate for going to the deathmatch here. Though as for the actual pick itself, we do see Youngsung getting the first pick in this spot, to where we do get constant talk about him wanting to get revenge for what happened last time in middle race, which again at least provides for a good storyline for this episode. But while it doesn't fully play out, as we do see him also talk about wanting revenge for all those that had a direct hand in making him lose in middle race, with Hyungmin being the last remaining of those, which again, I'm sure he'll be responsible for Hyungmin's elimination. But again, for him to obviously have that disastrous middle race 1, but go on to win middle race 2, again, is a good storyline for him. But anyway, we get to the role selection, where Yunsung does obviously take the most powerful role first, that being copy, which actually ends up being one of the new skills for this version of the game, with it being pretty overpowered, and obviously being extremely versatile and allowing you to copy another player's ability, with that ability sticking until the next time you have to reset, which allows for him to constantly change his ability, though he cannot select the same ability back to back, which does add a bit of a wrinkle there. I'll always see Yohyun then take Gravity with his second pick, which functions the same as last time, still a very powerful ability that essentially ends up being the make or break for this game. We then see Yeonju pick Silence, which ends up upsetting the majority's plans once again, where they had planned on using Silence and Reset to weaken copy. Though obviously that's something that can't fully go through at this point, though we do see Dongmin still picking Reset, as Reset is actually a pretty powerful ability in this version of the game, more powerful than in the original version, where there's more skills that rely on resetting. But then we proceed to see Hyungmin pick Push, again the same ability he had as last time, while his partner ends up picking With. You have Dongmin's partner picking Mirror, which again, kind of surprised it dropped off this low, again considering it can be pretty useful in certain situations. We then see Yeonju's partner pick Deletes, all while Gaehyung ends up getting the other new ability, and that being Offer, a pretty strange ability here that allows you, after resetting, to transfer cards to another player, which can be helpful in the case that your ally needs to move a specific amount, or you want to force another player to have more higher numbered cards, but again, feels like a role that is extremely circumstantial, to where it's not a surprise that it dropped this low. But finally through this, that means Yunsung's partner ends up being left with Union, where he had previously talked about how there was no way he was going to pick Union again, only obviously be left with it here, though again, they did end up fixing the skill in this spot by making the ability voluntary, which does largely fix the issues with the skill from last time. But anyway, the game does start to where straight up, I mean, the game does play out in a pretty monotonous way here, where Yunsung's side ends up really being in the lead for the majority of the time here. And while there is a bit of a shakeup at the tail end, it wasn't enough to really make this game particularly interesting, as though I did find it interesting that Yunsung took a bit more of a leadership position in this game, showing him play a bit more out in front, to where this is probably his best individual performance across this season at least. Though throughout this match, we do see a lot of tension between Dongmin and Hyungmin and Yuhyun, where, again, he simply just does not work that well with them, to where we see them arguing over what to do, and Dongmin being annoyed at how he doesn't listen like Hyungmin does. While Hyungmin constantly suspects that Yohyun is actually working with the other side, to where, again, it really makes you question, like, why do Yohyun even bother working with them this round, considering how many complications there were along the way, and considering the fact that also Yohyun had the option many times throughout the actual playing of the match to flip sides and take the win for himself. He simply just never really does it. And instead, we see Yunsung's side essentially just completely ice him out, where they constantly use Silence and Copy to effectively stop Gravity, which the utilization of it was really the crux of the majority alliance's strategy, and intending on using Gravity and Mirror to shoot the other alliance forward, giving them essentially an auto win. Were the first 4 to finish, that would essentially guarantee that this alliance would have 5th and 6th place. Though again, the other team ends up playing pretty effectively in stopping that plan, where we spend most of the game just leading into a pretty easy win for Yunsung's team, with literally all 4 of them being tied for 5th at a point in the game. As the game nears its finish, we do get this reveal from Hyungmin, him realizing a loophole and there being a gap between the end of Copy's ability and the start of Silence's ability that allows for Gravity to be free for a short period of time, allowing them to pull Union back at a point where it was about to finish, essentially opening up the game for Dongmin to squeak out coming in 6th, while Yunsung ends up coming in 5th. Again, being a fun ending to this game, though really the rest of it was just kind of boring to me. Though here we do see Dongmin and Yunsung have to agree on who to throw in, which I wonder who that's going to be, as obviously Dongmin's never going to throw in Youngmin, and Youngsung just worked with Yeonju throughout the entire match, to where obviously Yoo-hyun was going in at this point. Though while this decision is being made, we do see Yoo-hyun and Youngmin decide to agree to not use the final black mission for some reason, which again felt dumb, where it definitely would have been optimal for the likes of Yoo-hyun and Yeon-seok and Yeonju to take the shot at Youngmin in this spot, but again, they don't. So unsurprisingly, Yoo-hyun decides to pick Yeonju. Again, assumedly because he thinks she's the weakest competitor, which again, not a particularly good look. That both times he had the choice on picking on who to go to deathmatch with. He ends up picking women both times. But anyway, deathmatches, once again, memory maze, which was boring. And we do see Yeonju being upset at how he's done it already. He has the advantage, which like he doesn't really. It's a very simple game. And again, really outside of this like ridiculous moment of Yeonju going on the same square as Yoo-hyun, which leads to this like over-the-top fake love montage with it claiming how close they are because they're friends of the same age. And outside that, this challenge is not particularly interesting. To where essentially we see Yeonju finding her way to Yoo-hyun's side of the board and proceeds to just follow his path, giving her a pretty easy win by the end, with Yoo-hyun just seeming kind of out of it here, not really making much progress. To where I do find it funny how in this instance we see Yeon-seong being happy at Yeonju's win, only for the other two to be upset for some reason. Where again, if you're Youngmin and Dongmin, you should definitely be happy at the fact that Yoo-hyun is going out in this spot over Yeonju. But either way, with that, we obviously lose Yoo-hyun, who, I'll be honest, is a player I've always had a tough time truly assessing, in the sense that, I think he is clearly one of the best players of the Genius. He's someone that seems to have a pretty good understanding of the game, someone that was constantly coming in second throughout this season, where while he never actually wins a main match, he's typically a major pillar of strategy on his side of the game, which again is always opposed to Dongmin and Youngmin, where while they do end up outplaying him at any points in this season, he himself is a pretty competent player. So again, I do think just simply from this season alone, I think you would come out of this thinking of him as one of the better players in the Genius's history, though he's also one that I don't find to be the most riveting TV, to where again, it plays into the issues of the season. The fact that again, he's a great player, and when again, has moments for sure, he's not like entirely boring, but I do think he is definitely someone that does very much feel like a game bot, someone that his existence on the show is largely revolved around purely his game ability, which leads to him, again, not being as interesting of a TV presence as what I ideally would have wanted. Though again, I do think it is interesting to see him face off against Dongmin and Youngmin, and again, at points winning battles against them. Again, obviously having the Constellation game, he beat them at their game in the last episode, but again, that was a game of intentionally losing. But again, I do think as a whole, again, he does come off as a largely competent player. The one that I just wish had a bit more charisma for a television product. Now for episode 10, an episode that I do really like. I think this is an episode that has a really solid main match, but also having a really iconic death match that we'll later talk about. But anyway, the episode does start with a pretty weird intro here of us getting a recap of the top 4, each of which getting their own nickname here, with Youngmin being called the greatest brainy player, Yeon-seong being called the steely mentality, I guess. Yeonju is the heroine with scary momentum, also, I guess. While Dongmin is named the man who bet his life on the game, which, again, they really couldn't come up with a better name than that for him. Before the main match is revealed, we do get the announcement that black garnets, as previously alluded, can be exchanged now for 2 real garnets. Again, ending that twist, which was a pretty pointless one. But here we're also told that garnets will play a big role towards the end of the game. AKA, there'll be a way for them to purge garnets from the game to take away from the prize pool. But either way, also here we get the reveal of some special guests, that being Jinho and Sangmin, with obviously Sangmin hamming his intro up and him taking in the air of the set. But it was cool to see the 2 previous winners back on this season, where obviously I think it makes a lot of sense that they would be the guest here in a spot where it had been on both of the previous seasons, and again, to have them return for this season, in turn essentially be on every single season, even though in this season obviously a much smaller role, it at least allows them to keep that title. And overall their appearance here ends up being a fun addition here, even though at the end of the day I don't feel like Sangmin ends up being as Sangmin-y as he could be, though it does end up being a pretty decent appearance from Jinho. But But anyway, we get the reveal here that the 10th main match is Chain Auction, another auction game where players are linked by a chain, which was a weird gimmick for this challenge. Though, like the other auction games, players are here given 20 chips to bid, with them getting points at the end of the game for each chip remaining. Though, interestingly, instead of bidding for specific tiles, we instead see them bid for who gets to pick their tile first, with every player getting a tile during each of the 4 rounds, though with the picks going counterclockwise, and the order starting with the person who won the bid and going counterclockwise from there, giving a lot of incentive and working with the people around you in the order. Now, during 2 of these rounds, you have the ability to buy symbols, while in the other 2, you have the ability to buy numbers, with the numbers 1 through 12 being available, 6 of which being available at each time, which are randomly distributed, to where the goal here is to create an equation that equals 10. With decimals removed, with you getting certain point totals based on how close you are to 10. Though the interesting aspect of this match is that each player will also be given one number at the beginning of the game that is kept a secret and is something you have to keep a secret, as at the end of the game, the other players will have the opportunity to guess what number you have, to where if they are correct, they get points for their final score, while you lose points for everyone that people get correct, which is a pretty big swing there, and in general, ends up probably being the most fascinating aspect of this format here, and you having to figure out a way to get to 10 while also making it not super obvious what your number is, to where in general I do really like this game. Now obviously I do like most auction games, where I do think they are typically some of the better main matches, to where I think this one's definitely benefited from the fact that there are so many factors playing into how you could potentially win this game, where again, if it was only who was the closest to 10, again, this would be a purely broken game, as we see later, and there being a very easy way to get the 10. Though, again, I think these other additions, along with the fact that you also have the ability to trade tiles and use coins to negotiate, really makes this game a lot more complex than its initial broken concept. Though here we also get the reveal that if a genius player ends up winning this game, they will end up getting 10 garnets along with their win. Though, if a guest wins the game, they will get 10,000 won instead. Which, it is funny to me that none of the genius players really seem to care about the prize money, with us never seeing any movement to keep those garnets for the prize pool, though we obviously do see Jinho and Sangmin talk about this, with Sangmin wanting to make sure that one of them wins, as they should, as their champions, and Jinho should have the pride of a champion, only for Jinho to just laugh at him, to where the show never shows them getting on the same page, though I think you can very much assume that they did based on certain actions down the road. But finally, we do get some pretty humorous content from Dongmin after he sees all the others clamoring to work with Jinho and Sangmin, with him being annoyed at how no one's talking to him now, leading to him mocking seasons 1 and 2 and hyping up how much harder this season is, which again I'm sure is a debate that will definitely not come up next season. But this is all while Hyunmin ends up working pretty closely with Jinho here, with Hyunmin intentionally trying to come in second to him, because again, he doesn't care about the prize money. So again, I don't get why he didn't just make a deal with Jinho just to go for the prize money at the very end anyway. But this does lead to Dongmin, interestingly, kind of working against Hyunmin's best interest here for a bit, where we do see him gather up Yeonsang and Yeonju and tell them how Hyunmin's working with the guests and wants them to make sure they don't sit next to each other to split them up, which again, nice to see Dongmin doing something against his closest ally in this spot. Though, to be fair, I think more than likely he did that just because he wanted to get back in with Hyunmin, not because he was actually intending on taking Hyunmin out in this spot. But either way, the game does eventually start to where the players are told that they can sit wherever they want, which I don't personally like as a part of this format, to where I would have very much preferred if this was randomized, as I do think the seating order here is very important, and I think it's very easy for a majority to take up all the slots together and through that just kind of run this game. Though thankfully the players themselves seem to recognize how important the seating is, to where they decide to do rock, paper, scissors to decide who gets to pick what seat they go in first, which again is a more fair way of handling this. But through this we do see Jinho and Yeonju picking the middle seats, to where when they do so we get another weird dumb love montage happening again, because I guess to them that's the only way to make Yeonju interesting on the show. But here we do also see Hyungmin and Dongmin conveniently sit next to each other at the front of the table, which allows them to collaborate throughout the entirety of this game. Though eventually we also get to round 1, which is for symbols, where during these rounds there's only going to be one multiply and one divide symbol. Division probably being the most important tile in this entire game, to which when he does so, we see Sangmin and Yeonju being confused, and later see that Yeonsang also didn't really realize why this was an important tile. So again, it does feel like Yeonmin was simply just a step above everyone else in this game, which I will also say, not a particularly good look for Sangmin to be this out of the loop in this spot. Anyway, we get to round 2, where we do get Dongmin asking Hyungmin if he needs anything, to where Hyungmin says that he can't get 1, though what they don't end up showing until a bit later is that he does eventually tell Dongmin that he wants 11 in particular, which Dongmin does allow him to get, which again would have been this big reveal in this spot of what his real plan is, but obviously we get that revelation saved for a bit later. But Dongmin does end up actually wanting to get 1 at this point, only for Yeonsang to outbid him, and Sangmin picks 1 before it gets to him, to where we do see him try to make a deal with Dongmin here for 15 chips, which is a ridiculous amount, in a spot where Sangmin himself doesn't even seem to need the 1, but finally Dongmin doesn't need it that bad either, where he really just wanted it just in case he got bad tiles later down the road. Where, in general, again, this makes it seem like Sangmin's reads are really off, which is, again, not a great look for him, though I do very much wonder how much he was really into this game, where, again, as I mentioned before, I do think there's definitely a big possibility that him and Jinho agreed to really just propel one of them to the win, and it would split the money afterwards. There are many points in this game, though, where you can very much tell that Sangmin is kind of just trying to propel Jinho's win more so than actually benefiting his own game, with him playing this pretty terribly throughout the majority of it. But anyway, with this we get to round 3, where at this point Dongmin does create a plan to ice out Yeonsang, once again by not letting him get a divider minus sign, which would make it impossible for him to get 10. Also considering how many chips he's used already, it would make it so he is very likely to be last in that case. So we do get this pretty big bidding battle between Yeonju, who has the backing of Hyungmin, Dongmin, and Jinho, and Yeonsang, who has the backing of Sangmin, to where both groupings end up pooling their chips, to which Yeonju's group ends up winning the battle here, allowing Jinho to get division for himself, with Jinho being the other person to seemingly recognize the strength of vision in this game, while Hyungmin ends up getting minus, leading to Hyungmin revealing to Dongmin that he can get anything in round 4, as he always gets 10, to where now we get the big flashback, the big reveal that Hyungmin had instantly figured this game out from the very beginning. At the moment where they reveal the rule that they get rid of the decimals, we see him already hatching this plan of needing to get 11 alongside a division sign, and at that point a minus sign, where in that spot he'll be able to create 10 no matter what his other 2 numbers are, as he could just divide his secret number with literally any number, subtract that from 11 to always give him 10, which again is the optimal way to play this game. Again, getting a division sign is very integral, but along with getting either a combo of 10 and plus or 11 and minus, where through that would essentially guarantee that you would have a 10 no matter what, in a spot where also you'll be able to keep your secret number secret, as there'd be no way for the others to guess what your number is, as it could be any number in that spot, to where again Hyungmin really games this game pretty much from the moment that the rules are revealed, which again can be definitely looked at as a flaw in this game, but again leads to a pretty fun reveal here. But anyway, with that, we then get to round 4, the final round of the game, where you see Sangmin winning the bid over Dongmin after making a deal with Dongmin to give him 10, which ends up going through, with Dongmin thinking that he got the number that he needed. That is, until we get the reveal that they are following order of operations, which is where Dongmin realizes that he's completely screwed, which is, to be fair, I think a pretty simple mistake here for him to make, one that ends up costing him the game here. Again, this ends up radically changing the formula Dongmin has, where we get the reveal that his secret number is 5, with him thinking that he had 12 minus 5 minus 10 times 5, which without order of operations would be 10, though through order of operations it instead becomes negative 38. Meaning that this strategy that Dongmin went all in on ends up coming off really ineffective here, though luckily for him, because Hyungmin doesn't have to have any specific number to be divided with his secret number, and his other number that he got is conveniently a 4, which is the perfect number that Dongmin needs in this spot. Dongmin does end up getting a better situation than what could have possibly happened here, though they do try to sneakily swap here, with them pretending like Hyungmin miscalculated as a way again to try to hide Dongmin's number, though that ends up being extremely see-through, to where, well, again, this very luckily allows him to get an equation that equals 10. It does lead to everyone knowing his number, which pretty much ends up screwing him over anyway. While Yeonsang ends up pulling a pretty similar maneuver here and trading with Jinho, but through that ends up trading points away as well, allowing Jinho to actually end this game with more chips than he started with Sangmin even giving Yeonsang chips here, but saying he's only going to do it if he gives it to Jinho, which again just adds to the theory that they were working together. But again, for Yeonsang, this also makes his number a bit too obvious here as well, taking points away from him, though this is where we do see Jinho's interesting take on this game, as, again, he had a similar strategy to Youngmin's, and it revolving around hiding his number, but doing so in a little bit less optimal of a way, where, again, he purposely doesn't make 10 to try to hide his number, to where while he loses points from that, obviously it makes it near impossible for people to guess his number as well, but obviously through the deal he makes with Yeonsang for new points, it kind of nullifies the disadvantage to begin with. Though really this ends up being a spot where Hyunmin actually had the game won here, where had Hyunmin not decided to trade his tile with Dongmin for no chips, a spot where he was originally actually going to trade with Yeonsang for the same chip total that Jinho traded for, again, he would have had the win. Though again, he essentially sacrifices the win here in order to try to avoid Dongmin coming in last, which doesn't even happen here. Despite us seeing Dongmin try to make deals with other players to not pick his number, with us seeing Sangmin actually go through this deal, we also see Yeonsang not go through this deal and go back on it. And a spot where, again, we see Jinho win the game, Hyunmin come in second, through that getting a token of life himself, while Sangmin is in last, though that doesn't matter, as the person in last of the players in the game is Dongmin, losing by only 1 point to Yeonsang, showing Yeonsang's betrayal actually mattering here and actually saving himself in this spot, again, showing him having a bit of a killer instinct that I don't think you would have expected him to have coming from the rest of the season, though. This is obviously Dongmin's going to the deathmatch, and we saw him previously threaten Yeonsang that if he betrays him, he's going to throw him in, only for him to not, and just pick Yeonju anyway, which is a pretty apt choice considering his views on Yeonju as a player. But anyway, it takes us to the deathmatch, which is Monorail. A really interesting game here that probably ends up being one of the more iconic games from the Genius to me. It being one that has the two players taking turns on putting down train pieces, on putting down train track pieces, to where they can place between 1 to 3 tiles at a time, to where those tiles in themselves can either be straight or curved, to where they have to, at the end, form a completed track, all while only having 16 tiles to work with the person that ends up finishing the track ending up winning. But you can also win the game by declaring that the track can't be completed, by correctly calling out that the track can't be completed, have the opportunity to complete the track, to where they win if they do, though if they don't, obviously the person that calls it out wins in that spot. All in all, a pretty complex game here that really plays out in an interesting way and ends up being one of my favorite deathmatch. It ends up being one of my personal favorite death matches, though ends up also being a game that is a bit broken, where this is a game that's pretty well known for having an optimal strat that, to be fair, would be pretty difficult to figure out on the spot, though we obviously see this game be gamed when it returns for the following season, where by that point pretty much everyone knew what to do in this game, and that there's a pretty simple solution that is essentially a guarantee for the person that goes second to win the game if they play optimally, which, again, obviously no one knew on this season, and that leads to a lot of suboptimal play, which does lead to a lot of suboptimal play here, as the game does start with a lot of talk about how flustered Dongmin is after his main match loss, and we do see him taking the first move here, which already is a bad play, and through that we see him making moves that Yeonju is surprised by, to where we essentially end up seeing both of them just make mistake after mistake, not taking any of the opportunities they could have to take the advantage in this game, to where, again, at the end of the day, this game is essentially one big math problem of you having to make sure that you're the person that gets the turn where there's 3 or less pieces left to put on the board, where through managing how many pieces are needed to complete the track, it becomes very easy to manage the number of pieces necessary, to where, again, playing accordingly will pretty much always lead to you getting the win here, though here we do see Yeonju seemingly just like accidentally making the move that was optimal for her, so at that point it does seem like Dongmin's game is over, to which we do get this very melodramatic montage as if he's going home, only for the music to stop when he says that it's not over till it's over, where he proceeds to make one more play here, placing pieces on the board to the side of the track already constructed, essentially making the track impossible by that point, but once again leaving Yeonju confused what Dongmin is doing here, with Dongmin essentially completely banking on selling Yeonju that this track is somewhat finishable, despite it clearly not being possible, and in what is one of the most insane moves in the Genius's history in my eyes, this actually works, where Yeonju does decide to place another piece down, only for Dongwon to proceed to say that it's impossible, giving him the win here, to where, again, this is just such an insane ending to this match, where we do get some great reactions to this from the other players, with Hyungmin being really excited, all while we get this complete shock from the remaining players, and Yeonsong having his hands in his face, to where, again, I do find this to be a very impressive move that Dongwon is able to execute here, again, being able to convince Yeonju that this is a completable track. Again, by being so resolute in the move that he makes here, while also keeping his composure, that, again, makes Yeonju buy into this, though it's also Yeonju, who has never been the most intellectual player in the world, and also is a player that doesn't seem to be able to think of these high-level strategies and piece things together here, to where, again, to me, it's not that shocking that she would buy into this, being one of the few players and probably all of the Genius that would buy into this. For a while, again, this is an impressive play for Dongmin. I think that's definitely something that you can counter that with, along with the fact that this is a move that's followed up by some disastrous play from Dongmin, where, again, in most situations, he just outright loses the game through how he plays the early portions of Monorail here. So while this is probably one of his greatest moments on this season, it's also probably the worst moment for him on this entire season. For a while, again, he obviously ends up winning the season, has a pretty impressive win in that. I think this is still a pretty major low point for his game, but with that, we do lose Yeonju, who, again, was fine. I mean, she was a purely affable figure, someone that, again, didn't really bring much to the game. I think she's someone that, again, I don't really have much faith in most Genius games, or while I think she could definitely skate on by through being in the majority and being someone that, again, people aren't looking at as too threatening, I feel like she's always going to be the type of player that is going to be sniped out at some point before the end. I think it's very rare that you're going to see Yeonju perform particularly well in a death match, to where obviously she does win in Memory Maze, though also it's Memory Maze. So I think in anything that requires these more analytical skills, these more logic-based skills, I feel like that is something that Yeonju is not particularly good at. With really Memory Maze probably being the only death match I could actually see her winning from this season. Though again, she's a purely affable presence. She did have fun moments here and there, particularly from her dynamic with Dongmin and her kind of dodo content at points. Though really at the end of the day, I do think she is a somewhat forgettable character despite how far she gets here, to where to me she comes off as probably the least notable presence of the top 7 on this season, where despite making it far, not someone I look at too highly in the Geniuses history. But with that, we then get to episode 11, the final 3 round, to which we started off with the same recap from the previous episode, with the same nicknames outside of Dongmin now being named the ruler of the battlefield, which I don't get how he got that nickname after the last episode. But also we get some focus on the dynamics of all the possible final 2 combinations, which felt like a big waste of time, considering we get the same content in the following episode between Dongmin and Hyungmin in particular. But eventually we obviously get the reveal that there will be 4 guests for today. To where, like season 2, these guests are returning players from this season, with us seeing the return of Yoo-hyung, Ah-young, Hui-jong, and Kyung-hoon, with Kyung-hoon probably being the most surprising pick of the bunch here, which probably should have been a clear indicator of his viability for a grand final, despite me being pretty shocked by that pick when I initially watched that season. But either way, the final main match here ends up being Doubting Yutenori, because thank God they found a way to bring Yutenori back to the show. But straight up, I actually do find this to be a much more interesting game here, one that actually has the guests and the players essentially playing 2 separate games at the same time, where obviously the guests end up playing the game of Yutenori, with them following similar rules to that of tactical Yutenori, though instead of throwing sticks, they instead have to roll a die that has the different movements on them, but interestingly, only they get to see what role they get, giving them the opportunity to lie, which if that goes unfettered, they will end up being able to move with whatever movement they claimed. Though, what is interesting here is that brings us to the Genius player's role in this match, and that for them, this entire game is based around how many Garnets they have, with the winner of the match being the person with the most Garnets by the end, essentially being the prototype for Garnet matches that end up being prominent in the following season, and a concept that I do like here, though I do think this is weird timing for it, where I think Garnet matches are a lot more impactful earlier in the game, as they have a lot more stakes, as Garnets can be pretty useful in future games to buy advantages or to negotiate, to where in the final main match here, it feels like those stakes aren't here, and instead obviously these stakes here are adding to the total prize pot. Yet again, it seems like that's something that most of this cast simply did not care about, making that aspect of the match not really mattering much. But again, everything the Genius players do here revolve around Garnets, in that the only way to stop other players from enacting their lies is through a Genius player doubting them, which if correct, they end up gaining a Garnet, but if wrong, they end up losing a Garnet, with what they end up losing ending up being the prize pot for the winning guess, adding more incentive for the guests to trick the players into doubting them. But the other interesting aspect of this game is that the Genius players also have to bet on the guests and how they perform, both on who finishes next, but also on the final winner, with those Garnets doubling if they get it right. But aside from that, they also end up being randomly assigned a player, to which they have to bet at least one Garnet on that player, but if that player goes on to win, they get 3 times what they betted if that player wins, which adds this further incentive for the genius players and the guests who work together, where as a whole, I do really like this game, and it plays out in a pretty fun way, though I will say I do find it kind of underwhelming for a final main match, where it does very much feel like this game does focus a lot more on the guests than it does the actual genius players. And again, the actual players that are playing to go on to win the season, to where even beyond that, it very much feels like their fates are largely tied to how the guests play in the Yutenori game, which, while again, the genius players can do all they can to try to propel those people to a win, it isn't guaranteed. To where, again, I don't love how indirect of a hand the genius players have in determining their fate here for a main match that is this important to the game. To where, while again, I do think this actually does end up bringing pretty good TV, I do think from a game design standpoint, I do think this probably could have been better utilized at a different point in the season. But as for the events of the game, obviously we do get instant jokes around Ah-young and no one wanting to be partnered with her, with Yeonsang really leading these jokes, which is ironic, as he is the one that actually ends up picking Ah-young down the road, though that doesn't get revealed until a bit later. All the show does reveal right away that Hyungmin ends up picking Kyunghoon, which does lead to some humorous content there from Kyunghoon, not believing anything he ends up saying, really playing into the great TV that Kyunghoon brings here, where I do think it is largely from his appearance here that really solidifies his spot in Grand Final, with him really just reaffirming how great of a TV character he ends up being here. But it is also here where we do get the flash forward for the episode, it being one that shows Hyunmin and Kyunghoon arguing, which really does not do much here, as again, this ends up essentially just spoiling the argument for later without adding much to the presentation of the show. But despite Hyunmin's partner being shown right away, we do actually get Dongmin and Yeonsang's partners being hidden from the beginning, in a spot where I don't think it really adds that much here, though we do get both of them ending up telling both of Ah-young and Yoo-yeon that they are their partners, or neither of them believe any of them, despite the fact that Hyungmin even goes to Yoo-yeon and tells him directly that Dongmin is his partner, only for him to still not believe that, to where really just no one ended up seeming to believe anyone here. And to be fair, there is reason for that. I mean, obviously there is incentive from the genius players to pretend to be other people's partners, to get them to coordinate with them, that way they have their actual partner and also now their fake partner. But again, no one's really effectively able to do so here. But again, the edit still tries to hype up this mystery, despite the fact that for me, I felt like it was pretty apparent who's partnered with who, especially when it was pretty clear from the offset that Huijong didn't have a partner, where we do get a lot of focus on Huijong's role in this episode, with Dongmin initially pulling him over and just openly revealing to him that he's not his partner. But despite that, we do see Huijong playing this game pretty actively, where we do see Dongmin coordinating with Huijong. They create signals to give to each other that Huijong seemingly does go through with here for some reason, as it doesn't really benefit him to do so. But despite the fact that Huijong doesn't have a partner, I do think he actually initially plays this round pretty well, though while it kind of crumbles around him after the first round, I do feel like initially him being able to actually convince both Hyungmin and Yeonsang to bet on him over their actual partners is kind of insane, even though again he ends up not living up to that. And beyond that, we also get some focus on him later in the episode of him trying to gather together the guests and try to get them to increase the prize pool, him seeming to be the only one that cares about that, which again is a plan that doesn't go through. And we later also see him very sloppily trying to get the actual genius players to give up Garnets, which again was never going to happen. Where again, Huijong really at the end of the day plays this very sloppily, though again I thought there was actually some decent play at the beginning at least. But obviously we get to the betting, where we do start off with seeing Hyungmin, after betting 1 on Kyunghoon, as he has to, and 5 on Huijong, we see him go to Kyunghoon and tell him that you can't win, as everyone has already agreed to make Huijong win, which I don't get why he's telling him this, as again, what incentive does Kyunghoon have to actually go through this plan? As again, throwing the first round here does him no good. All it does is benefit Huijong and the players in the game, which is again, why does Kyunghoon care about that? I felt like that was some pretty poor play from Hyunmin. And even through this, we see him lie to Kyunghoon, telling him that he did bet 5 on him and only 1 on Huijong instead, which again doesn't really make sense considering how hard he's trying to go for this. And again, this leads to a lot of conflict between the two. And even then, I mean, Kyunghoon actually doesn't even believe that this Huijong plan's even a thing, where we see him confronting Dongmin about this, where Dongmin had previously promised him that he was going to bet 5 on him, which he does actually go through with here. Though finally, none of these bets really matter, as they were all wrong anyway. But also, again, really funny to see no one betting more than 1 on their partners in a spot where that could have skyrocketed them to the win in this spot. But anyway, the game starts where you see a lot of people rolling busts and not many people doubting initially for whatever reason, despite us seeing other guests tell them to doubt it. That is, until Hyunmin decides to doubt Kyunghoon, leading to Kyunghoon obviously being outraged at this, as Hyunmin is his partner, leading to Kyunghoon confronting him, realizing that Hyunmin didn't bet 5 on him, and giving us the classic Kyunghoon moments, and showing himself to be a complete wild card here, clearly telling Hyunmin that he doesn't believe him and proceeds to walk away and declares his freelancer status. And this does lead up to him finishing first in the first round here, leading to another fun fight between the two, where Kyunghoon doesn't even bother looking at Hyunmin and just says, "Don't lie," which is a clip that I always remembered as being part of his intro package in Grand Final. But despite this, we do see Hyunmin doubt him in this spot, only for it to turn out that he was actually right, meaning that in this spot where Kyunghoon was incensed at Hyunmin for lying to him, it was actually a spot where Kyunghoon was also lying to him back. And despite all this, we actually see Hyunmin proceed to create another plot revolving around Kyunghoon following this and wanting Kyunghoon to lie so that Hyunmin can doubt it to get Garnets, which again, why is Kyunghoon gonna do this? And what do you know? Kyunghoon doesn't listen to him, which ends up sinking Hyunmin in this game, and to be fair, rightfully so. I think this is all really sloppy play from him, especially him thinking that he can trust Kyunghoon again after Kyunghoon had literally just betrayed him, and he had betrayed Kyunghoon earlier, where why are you even putting any faith in this relationship at this point? But again, I think it's all of this chaotic energy that Kyunghoon brings to the show here that ends up really locking in his place on Grand Final. But finally, the person to finish first here ends up actually being Ah-young, in a spot where we do get the reveal formally that Yeonsang was her partner, to where he is even shocked at this, as no one, including himself, ended up betting on her. To where this ends up losing a decent chunk of Garnets here for the Genius players. So again, this match ends up really decreasing the prize pool by a pretty pitiful degree. But following this round, we do see Dongmin having the initial lead, mostly because he didn't end up doubting as much as the other two, where they lost numerous Garnets due to doubting incorrectly, with us getting the reveal now that Dongmin has only been doubting and signaled by Huijong, allowing Dongmin to maintain his Garnets, while further excelling his lead and shifting his strategy at this point into betting more so on his partner, a novel concept, though even then only bets 1 on Yoo-hyun, when he obviously could have bet 5 on him. But Yoo-hyun ends up being the next to finish here, and ends up going on to win the game in what is a pretty insane stretch of pretty perfect rolls for him, to where we see them constantly get doubted, only for it to turn out that they're actually real, giving Yoo-hyun the win here alongside Dongmin, though in the process, the Genius players end up losing 24 Garnets over the course of this match. The majority of those coming from Hyunmin, who ends up having a pretty disastrous performance through this match here, leaving the prize pool at only 60 Garnets, in a spot where they end up deciding to keep Yeonsang's Garnets in the prize pool after he's eliminated, because if they didn't, this would have been a truly pathetic prize. But either way, we get to the death match, obviously between Hyunmin and Yeonsang, which, again, pretty apt battle here. Again, these two setup rivals from much earlier in the game. And the match here ends up being a new game, that being betting black and white. Another black and white variant, though obviously mixing in this aspect of betting, obviously, to where the difference between this and previous versions of black and white is the fact that you have to entirely predetermine what tiles that you're going to use during each round and how many chips you're going to bet on each tile without seeing the other person's board. And once the game starts, you can call or fold if your opponent bets more during specific rounds, to where at that point you can very much compare this to poker, but a poker game where the cards that you utilize per round are obviously predetermined. And again, it's a game that I do like on paper. I think this definitely had the potential to be one of my favorite death matches, where again, I already love the original black and white, and making it more complex here by adding in these betting aspects, I think is a great idea. I do think there can be an issue here that stems from the fact that the optimal strat here is pretty basic, where we see Hyunmin figure it out right away, and it's something that even I pieced together from the moment this game was announced, to where I do think that is kind of an issue here, though it's a similar issue that the original black and white has as well, to where, and again, even if that is the case, there still is some complexity on what specific tiles are where and how much you bet on each tile. So again, I do think there probably was some untapped complexity to this game, though sadly we never really get to see it, to where this is the only time this game gets utilized, despite it almost being played another time that we'll later talk about. And even the spot that we see it play out here is one where Yunsung gets completely demolished, where for some reason he doesn't fully recognize the optimal strat here of betting big on your high tiles and really front-loading them at the beginning, to where he instead tries to evenly distribute his tiles and his bets on them, to where with Youngmin, again, utilizing the better strat of front-loading all his higher tiles at the beginning and betting big on them, it leads to this being a complete slaughtering, with Youngmin getting enough chips through the first 4 rounds to just fold for the rest of the game, giving him the win, which, to be fair, I think is pretty fitting of the Youngmin-Yunsung rivalry here, to see Youngmin outplay Yunsung once again, and obviously through this it gives us the Dongmin-Youngmin Final 2, which was prophesized, which again, is the main storyline of this season, and is what this season's mostly remembered for. But with that, again, we do lose Yunsung here, and again, I like Yunsung. I think Yunsung is a very capable player of the Genius. I think he's someone that obviously showed a lot of perpetuity through these death matches, and while his main match performance has been a little bit more rocky, I do think Yunsung is a player that, again, there is definitely a lot of potential there. We do see some of that potential in his next appearance, while it doesn't necessarily go as well, I think he does show a lot more perpetuity for playing with a bit more of a killer instinct in that game, to where, again, I think Yunsung is a player that is, again, a very solid Genius player. However, I do think on this season in particular, I think there are many points where he's just kind of aloof in the game. He gets outplayed by the people around him. And while I do think some of that is due to bad luck, I do think also a lot of it is also just him being a bit too naive at points in the game, to where overall, again, I think he's a very likable presence. I think he's someone that, again, is a capable player for sure, and probably has more fun character stuff from him than likes of like Yuhyun and Jongbam, who are also, again, these other solid players that are, again, a little bit more boring on this season, where, again, Yunsung's not the most dynamic personality in the world, though. Again, probably is at least more entertaining than them, so at least that's something. But with that, we now get to the finale, which is pretty easily the best Genius finale, with this genuinely feeling like a battle between the two sides that ends up being relatively close, though even then, the final game ends up being one that kind of goes out in a little bit of a whimper, to where, again, I guess you could debate it a bit more of Season 2, though I think Season 2's games in particular were not as genius-y to me, with the likes of Quattro and Truth Detector, and even then, Indian Hold'em's not particularly interesting, to where, again, I think the overall games that were picked here are ones that felt a lot more fitting for the Genius, and required a lot more skill for the most part. But anyway, like other seasons, we start this finale off with a long recap sequence, really highlighting the Dongmin-Hyungmin relationship, which obviously they ham up quite a bit here, with this literally taking up 12 minutes of the episode. And we also get the typical weird banter between the two as they stand in the dark room with spotlights on them, which was all really boring. So eventually the previous players arrive, with Junghoon being the only one to not show up here, but there are 11 items to divvy out here. But before that, we have to also waste more time in talking to the final 2, which is meant to be this like jury questioning segment, though I've never found it particularly interesting, and it doesn't really play much of a factor into things. Though it is through this that you clearly tell the momentum that Dongmin has here, where we see them cheering as Dongmin appears, to where we get a lot of talk about how most of the eliminated players were Dongmin's allies, to where once we get to the vote, we do see Dongmin getting a wide majority of the votes, where in previous seasons we had seen items being distributed pretty evenly, seemingly purposely so by the players, with them taking that into consideration, though this ends up being a situation where this group simply did not care, to where Dongmin ends up getting 8 items in comparison to Hyungmin's 3, though in reality, I think a lot of these votes here do actually make a lot of sense here. Now, initially it can feel very jarring to see this group be so pro-Dongmin, a spot where Dongmin did come off a bit abrasive and domineering at points, while Hyungmin seemed to be a mostly affable presence, but again, it seemed like this cast really respected Dongmin for varying reasons, though I think the most obvious of which being the fact that he did work with them and did build these connections with them throughout the game, all while Hyungmin didn't seem to. And I think that is a genuine flaw of Hyungmin's gameplay style, is the fact that while he is, again, very good at the more intellectual aspects of the game, dominates in a lot of the main matches of the season, has a high perpetuity for a decent amount of the death matches, but he's also a player that doesn't really work with that wide of a grouping of people here. I think he does falter in the more social aspects of the game, again, not branching out and building these connections in a way that Dongmin did. But obviously, your social skills are not as integral to the game of the Genius as it is to, again, obviously social strategy games. I do still think, considering how important these abilities can be in the final, it is still an aspect of this game that seems to be a pretty glaring hole in Hyunmin's game here, to where while not a major flaw for him as a Genius player as a whole, it is still a flaw. here. But eventually you finally get to the actual final starting, with it being a best of 3 death matches, like always, with the first and last games being reoccurring games here, and that being 12 Jongi and betting rock, paper, scissors, where Dongmin gets to pick which one they play first for having the most garnets, which was in previous seasons an additional item, though in this season they seemingly just took out the notion of the person with the most garnets getting an extra item, and essentially made this a guaranteed power that the person with the most garnets gets, which to be fair is not that integral of a power in the grand scheme of things. Dongmin does end up picking 12 Jongi first here, which, and I think is a very solid game to have in the final here, one that again is very intellectual, again a chess-like game that, and again, tests the skills that you would expect the ultimate winner to have, to where this ends up having pretty much the same rules as the last time we saw this game, though now with the inclusion of a 90-second timer per turn. Again, a nice addition here to add more pressure to the players, though also would not shock me if this is simply added here to add another skill to the game, and there being a skill that allows you to get an additional 90 seconds for a turn, one that Hyungmin gets, and one that Hyungmin doesn't being able to use, as his entire strategy is based around him making moves quickly to not give Dongmin enough time to think through his moves. And really at the end of the day, this ends up being a pretty easy win for Hyungmin, in a spot where Hyungmin did seem to have the massive advantage coming into it, to where he had already won this game previously, and even when him and Dongmin did practice matches in the lead up to that game, Hyungmin had won all those, where again, not a shocker that Hyungmin wins this seemingly easily, though. With that, we get to the second game, again a new game, that being Same Number Hunt, a modification of Same Picture Hunt, where in that game you have a board of letters and behind them are patterns you have to memorize, while here instead, what is behind them are numbers and symbols, where in each round a number will be announced that they will have to buzzer in and say the correct letters to form an equation that equals the number that was announced, to where the first to 10 points wins, a game that I really personally adore. Again, this has always been one of my personal favorite death matches in the series, with this specific match probably being one of my favorite matches in the history of the show, with it being this really great back and forth, with it also being edited in a really fun way here as well. But right off the bat, we do see both seemingly struggling here after only getting 5 seconds to memorize the board, which is pretty insane that that's the case, to where neither of them know the majority of the board, though we do see Dongmin surprising people here with him not just memorizing the beginning of the board like Hyungmin did, but really taking advantage of connecting letters to words to help him memorize numbers from throughout the board, while also being able to pick up on numbers that were revealed by Hyungmin, to where he ends up having a seemingly wider scope of the board than Hyungmin, leading to him having an early lead here, all while the song Centuries from Fall Out Boy plays, which adds this pretty epic tone to this challenge, which despite it only actually being utilized in this one spot here for this season, it's actually probably the song I remember being utilized the most from this season. But his song does lead into a pretty epic moment here of Dongmin utilizing his double chance item, an item that allows him to get 2 points from making an equation using 3 numbers and 2 symbols, which seems brutally difficult, yet we do see Dongmin doing so pretty effectively here, especially by utilizing ×1 to make that equation a lot easier to put together. Though really again, Dongmin ends up maintaining the lead the entire way, even through a funny round where no one knows the answer and Dongmin does this fake out with Hyungmin of slamming the table, which I've always found funny. But when Dongmin reaches 9 points, we do see him utilize his priority item, allowing him to answer the following question without the worry of the buzzer, to where we do see him telling the dealer as she draws a number to give me a good number, friend. And I do really love the moment here where we do get the number reveal, which is one that Dongmin instantly knows, to where we have him say, "Thank you, friend." And as he says friend, we get the zoom in on him as he says it, which very much reminds me of a moment from like a shonen, specifically like something from like Dragon Ball Z, of Goku thanking his friends as he's about to launch his spirit bomb. I don't know why, but this has always been a moment that always felt really badass to me. But either way, Dongmin ends up winning here, taking us to the final game, that being betting rock, paper, scissors, which I will say, again, I like betting rock, paper, scissors as a game, but I think it is a terrible game to be ending this season on. Probably the weakest point of this finale here, and the fact, definitely a downside of the finale here, where again, it simply just does not work effectively in this spot where the players only get the info of the people that end up backing them, which ends up giving this massive advantage to Dongmin here and him getting 8 people's information in comparison to Hyungmin's 3, to where while there are also 3 virtual players being added here that both of them know, again, it is a pretty big information gap between the two. But this clearly ends up being a losing battle for Hyungmin, especially when considering the fact that all 3 items that are utilized for this game end up all going to Dongmin here as well. To where I am personally shocked at the fact that they didn't utilize betting black and white as the final game for this season, as I think that would have been a much more satisfying way to conclude this season. A game that is more fair, regardless of who backs who in this spot. But despite all this, we do see Hyungmin playing to the best of his ability initially, and again, playing in rounds where he doesn't have the info to make it tougher for Dongmin to get any points there. And I should also mention the fact that they did actually fix the broken aspect of this game from earlier for the final here, and them adding an ability to bet on draw, which again stops you from being completely iced out getting points because of your opponent tying. And really, again, the game ends up being surprisingly even for the first half of it, though we do eventually get to a point where Hyungmin decides to go all in, making a big move, betting all of his money on win, all while Dongmin ends up actually losing, taking Hyungmin from potentially taking the lead had he been right there to instead being down 8-0, to which we end up montaging the rest of the match, with it being very clear that Dongmin was gonna win. Though somehow we do actually see Hyungmin get back up to 10 points by the end of the match, though again Dongmin has 18, declaring him the winner of the season. To which, before we go, we have to end the season on short confessionals from everybody about what they learned from the experience, which was weird, felt very modern Survivor-like, but either way, Dongmin winning here, I think is a satisfying outcome. I remember it's one that I was personally shocked by when I first watched this season, where straight up, the way I actually got introduced to the Genius is that I got into the Genius when Grand Final started airing, to where I made the mistake of watching the first few minutes of the premiere Grand Final before realizing it was this big all-star season, to where I went all the way back to the beginning to start watching the show. However, through that, I always misremembered that Hyungmin won this season, to where I remember when I first watched this season, I fully thought Hyungmin was winning the season the entire time. To where Dongmin winning at the end, again, was a surprise to me, though I think it's a very fitting end to this season. Again, I think it is one that perfectly makes sense considering how this season plays out, to where while Hyungmin, again, has a very impressive run, I think the fact that Dongmin ends up beating him at the end makes a lot of sense considering how much focus there was throughout the season on Dongmin's personal connections, how much we saw Dongmin do a lot of the legwork for the duo. To where while, again, Hyungmin is definitely a very impressive player, especially when finding solutions for each of the games, I do feel like Dongmin was definitely a more active participant in making a lot of those plans go through, while also being a very competent strategic mind as well, where I think there are many points in this season where we see Hyungmin having to go up to Dongmin and asking for his approval on things where we don't really see that much of the opposite, to where, again, I think a Dongmin win here is a very satisfying one, to where, while I do think at this specific point in the Genius, I think you could argue the fact that Hyungmin is the better player than Dongmin, especially considering the massive hole in Dongmin's game that we saw in the final 4 round. I do feel like as a whole, I still feel like either one of these obviously were going to be impressive wins, where Dongmin's legacy obviously just further continues down the road. Before we wrap up the video, I obviously want to give my closing thoughts on the finalists, starting it off with Hyungmin, who, again, is one of the best players in the history of the Genius. I think this season is a large reason why, where obviously he does return for Grand Final, has a very deep run there, but I do think it is this appearance in particular that really ends up putting him in the elites, to where, again, I think his Grand Final appearance definitely shows a lot more holes in his game than he demonstrated here. But I think in this season in particular, again, I think he has such a great run, has some very impressive maneuvers through the game, again, is able to piece together most of the games from the very beginning in a way that we hadn't really seen. I think really only Jinho is maybe the person that you would compare that to, though I think Jinho is someone that's a bit less consistent than someone like Hyungmin, to where, again, I think there's a lot of impressive play from Hyungmin from that light. Though from a character standpoint, again, I could definitely see a world where people look at Hyungmin as a game bot, where I think Hyungmin definitely fits into the likes of Yohyun and Jungbom and Yunsong, and again, a lot of these more normal people that played the Genius of, again, not the most riveting TV personalities, but people that are very good at the game. Despite that, I think Hyungmin is better TV than those people. Now, I don't know how much he is naturally. I think a lot of that stems from the fact that he is so important to this season's storyline. And again, he also acts as like the straight man to Dongmin's more wacky antics, to where him having Dongmin to play off of probably excelled his character here. But again, I do think the fact that he is also such a unique presence on the show, being one that is the youngest person to play the Genius by a decent margin, yet was able to dominate the field despite that, I think is something that makes him a very unique character on this season, despite the fact that, again, he might not be the most vibrant person personality. But with that, we obviously get to the winner in Dongmin. And again, obviously Dongmin's legacy just further expands in the following season, though at this specific point, again, Dongmin is still a very impressive player. Again, plays an extremely dominant game, one that has him running the show alongside Hyungmin for a good chunk of the run. Now, again, there are definitely points where, again, he loses favor. Again, the final 7 round is one where he's on the bottom. He, again, has a very sloppy final 4 round, where, again, his mistake in Monorail is probably debatably the worst mistake a winner of the Genius ever makes. Debatably the worst mistake a Genius winner ever makes, though really outside that, he has so many skills for gaming. And despite him being looked at as a comedian that no one took seriously from the offset, he is someone that is able to pick up on the majority of the games from the offset. Again, really, again, leading the strategy with Hyungmin, to where while Hyungmin's more of the person that calculates things out, again, Dongmin also had a competent strategic mind on his own and was really able to corral people together. Where again, he is the person doing the legwork and pulling people into groups, making deals with them, and at this point in particular, it ends up being essentially this mix, I think, of Jinho and Sangmin. Again, having the more natural charisma that Sangmin has that allows him to have this group around him, while still having this more analytical mind that Jinho has as well, where, again, I think Dongmin comes out this season looking like a very solid player. So again, while definitely having his faults in the game, definitely still one of the best players in the Genius up to this point. But from a character standpoint, I think he's, again, definitely one of the better characters of the season. I mean, really, I think it's between him and Ah Young for the best character of the season, with obviously Dongmin having more screen time in the grand scheme of things than Ah Young, to where I think through that, again, you would probably just outright say Dongmin is the better character. Though, again, I think his humor doesn't fully stick with me at many points in the season, but and he is definitely the biggest personality of the bunch, someone that really just takes control of the room, which again plays into his overall gameplay style, but also again just fully shows why he is such a good TV presence, and the fact that he always has to be leading the conversation, and through that does say some funny things at points, even though again not all the time, but still definitely fun character on the season, definitely great player, very satisfying winner to the season, and his overall appearance here being a very impressive one. But with that, that is the entirety of the Genius Black Garnet. And again, some of my thoughts on the season, again, I think it is good. Again, I obviously think every season of the Genius is good, and again, Black Garnet sticks with that. However, I personally do find this to be my least favorite season still. Well, again, I think there are many good aspects to the season. Again, the Dongmin Hyungmin storyline, the pretty solid game design across this season, with it having some of my favorite main matches and death matches across the show's history. By far, I think easily the best deathmatch season of the show. And again, having a very high level of gameplay. However, again, I think the cast is something that doesn't really click with me as much as other seasons. I also think this season doesn't come off as fun to me as the other seasons. So again, it does feel a bit more game body in nature, yet again, it's still a solid season of reality television. It's still amongst the best season of reality television I've ever seen, though I do think my latest rewatch of the season did make me go down a bit on my general opinion of the season, but it's still a very solid season of the show, with some of the best storylines of the series, some fantastic game design, and some all-time great characters from the likes of Dongmin and Ah Young, to where, despite it being my least favorite season, it's still one of the best seasons of reality television I've ever seen. But with that, again, those are my thoughts on Genius Black Garnet. Now, again, only one more season of the Genius left to go. I've obviously done retrospectives of seasons 1, 2, and 3. Again, I do intend on doing the final retrospective for the Genius and Genius Grand Final next year, so stay tuned for that. Beyond that, I also do intend on doing a couple other extra videos following that, particularly a ranking of every main match and death match, which is a video I've been wanting to do for a while, though I did want to rewatch all the seasons before making that video. In general, obviously just expect more of the same style of content from the channel, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.